Yo,
Hey Patrick, you
yo,
there?
yo, how are you?
Yeah, I'm doing well. Thanks for calling me.
Yeah, sure.
So, like I said in the email, there's a bunch of different uh, topics that I've been recently looking into, and if you're any one of them that you're interested in, I could talk about. So, is there anything in particular that you had in mind?
Let's start with the Gacy case. It's good.
Yeah, sure. So, I sort of told you this before in a YouTube comment, but like when I saw because I spent the last several months looking into the whole Johnny Gosch abduction. I've been following a podcast by someone named Sarah Dimeo, Dimeo, who has been working on this podcast called Faded Out. She's trying to solve the Johnny Gosch case, so I've been following that and trying to help her out. And I I happened to notice that Phillip Paske, who was the business partner of John Norman in that sex trafficking ring, who
Hmm.
also worked for John Wayne Gacy, like he looks a lot like one of the abductors of Johnny Gosch. And so I just tried to confirm all sorts of things, and in basically every possible way, Philip Paske looks, Philip Paske matches the Johnny Gosch abductor in every way. Like they're both child traffickers. They were both connected to the Franklin scandal. They both have long blonde hair. They're both known to disguise themselves as a woman, and they're both over 6 feet tall. Like they're both thin. They both have blue eyes. They both have acne, and pretty much every single physical trait matches up. So I just found that pretty interesting, and it seems like the same group of people involved with Gacy later went on to become part of the Franklin network too.
Yeah, I heard about those many comparisons, and they're all accurate. Yeah, so it's more likely that Philip Paske was the man who abducted than allegedly Adam of Johnny Cash. Yeah.
Yeah, and the same person, like the perpetrator who kidnapped Johnny Gosch is named Tony. Like that's the name that Paul Benassi gave. It might just be a pseudonym. We don't really know because he's never been identified. But the same person shows up in other child abductions elsewhere in the country. Like uh, Johnny Gosch was kidnapped in 1982, and then 6 years later, there was a girl in California named Michaela Garrett who was also abducted by someone who fits the exact same description. Uh, and Paul Benassi actually identified the photograph, identified the composite sketch of the person who kidnapped Michaela as the same person who was Tony who abducted Johnny Gosch. So it makes sense that this same person would be part of a ring that was going across the country kidnapping other children. And the Delta Project, John Norman's whole Delta Project seems to have some connections to California. Like you remember, like in the video that you made about Dean Corll and Elmer Wayne Henley,
Yeah.
like there was child pornography found found in Houston that Dean Corll's victims were appearing in, and then that led to some arrests that were taking place in Santa Clara.
Correct.
So yeah, there's definitely a link there between what John Norman was up to and California. So that all makes me think that Philip Paske was uh, Philip Paske was one of the abductors of Johnny Gosch, and I've just been corresponding with uh, Larry Potash, the Chicago anchor who talked about all those stories, trying to get details from him and seeing if I can confirm it. So that's
Nice.
really an
Nice.
ongoing thing right now.
Oh, cool. Very good to hear.
Yeah.
Let me ask you this: Are you like the founding father of CAVDEF, or just someone, a member who contributed stuff like it with it?
Uh, I'm not the founder. Like CavDef, the organization initially started out just focusing on election integrity during the 2016 elections because there were a lot of irregularities during the Democratic primaries. It looked like the votes were being manipulated in favor of Hillary Clinton
Mm-hmm.
uh,
Correct.
to hurt Bernie Sanders, and so I was following the Bernie Sanders campaign during that time, and I got involved with CavDef, and eventually I became one of the only members who was actually still there working on it, and I got the whole wiki started because I mean, it's one thing to like just know that elections are being tampered with, but if you want to do something about it and actually catch the people who are responsible, you have to dig deeper, do some kind of investigative work, and see who is actually in charge of these elections. Like, who are the people who own the voting machine companies?
Yeah.
Who's
Yeah.
responsible for programming them? And doing all that sort of investigation pretty much got me into all these other conspiracies that I had never really given much credence to before. Stuff like, the JFK assassination, Watergate, Iran Contra, 9/11, and then finally, the darkest thing that I came across through that was these protected pedophile networks, like the Franklin scandal.
Yeah.
Like, that you may not have heard this before, but like one of the things in the Franklin case that was instrumental in covering it up was the Omaha World Herald. Like the local newspaper in Omaha was pretty much just saying these children are liars, like they should be indicted for perjury, and they were just putting out all these super biased propaganda pieces. And the Omaha World Herald it was the owner of the largest voting machine company in the U.S. So you have this company that's covering up Franklin while at the same time in control of the majority of votes in the United States, which is something that was really worrying to me.
Yeah.
And ultimately, I came from learning about pedophile rings to coming across Dave McGowan's work concerning programmed serial killers. So, I mean, CAVDEF definitely broadened its focus from just elections to the whole, corrupt backdrop.
The whole spectrum. Yeah.
Yeah, because you really can't separate one sort of conspiracy from the other. If you start looking into one thing like rigged elections, you'll end up finding all this other stuff.
Yeah.
So
Correct. Yeah, I really love that website, CavDev. I mean, the serial killers Wikipedia entry is really just mind blowing. I wish I could add that information in the first parts of my YouTube series.
yeah, thanks. I mean, like that's sort of my whole goal with that was to go through Dave McGowan's work, see if I could, find some of the sources that he used, like newspaper articles and such, and then also try to build on his work. Because the way I see it is, Dave McGowan, he asked all the right questions. He highlighted all these things in the cases that just don't make sense.
Mm-hmm.
Because I know that, before I never questioned, like, the story of Ted Bundy, for example, but when you actually start to break it down, you start to wonder, how could any of this be the way that we were taught it happened? It just doesn't make sense. So what I think that should be done from that point on is, take Dave McGowan's work and start to really dig individually into these cases and try to find people who were involved and see if they're willing to talk. Try to actually go from questioning the official story to coming up with a real story and seeing what really did happen. Who are the actual killers who worked with Ted Bundy, for example?
Yeah, yeah.
That's been my goal. And if you want, I can talk a bit about the weird stuff that I found with, the whole Grand Junction case with Ken Botham and the corrupt sheriff there who was picked out by the witness instead of Ted Bundy.
Yeah, I would love to hear your new revelations about Ted Bundy. Please go.
Sure.
Yeah.
And also, I wanted to ask, like, is there a part 3 to the Ted Bundy video? Because I was trying to find it on your channel, but it wasn't there. It's just like there's a gap between 2 other videos.
Yeah, that's correct. A few of them are deleted by YouTube, but I have them online on Daily Motion, so I will send you the links after the interview.
Alright, oh, cool. Yeah, that'd be great. So, I mean, do you remember how in the chapter on Ted Bundy, McGowan said, like, oh, the star witness confidently identified the person she had seen, the Pickton County undersheriff?
Yeah, I think it was Carol Durant. She was heavily influenced by Peter Hayward.
Well, yeah, that was in Utah, but I'm talking about the later stuff that took place in Colorado.
Oh yeah.
Because like Ted Bundy was said to have murdered Karen Campbell at the
Wildwood Inn.
Yeah, at the Wildwood Inn in Aspen, and there was supposedly a witness who saw Ted Bundy and could pick him out. But then when they put her on the stand and they said like, "Oh, is this person in the courtroom?" and she's like, "Yeah," and then they asked her to point to him and she didn't point to Ted Bundy. She actually pointed to the undersheriff of Pickton County, like the second in command of the sheriff's office.
Jesus, really?
Yeah.
Whoa.
So like
How did you come with that? But because it doesn't said in the McCown's book.
It says that in McGowan's book briefly, but I mean, it's definitely like easy to miss. It was just a brief mention that he made. But when I actually looked into who the sheriff was, it turned out that there was a huge other scandal that he was involved in before he came to Pickton County. So yeah, like, because I know that like Anne Rule actually wrote about this in her book. And by the way, before I get into that, like, do you find it a bit weird that Anne Rule, like, she lived in all the same places where Ted Bundy lived at the same time
Yeah.
Ted Bundy was living there before they met each other?
Yeah, that's
Now,
it. I think that's very suspicious, and because they had such a close relationship with each other, you can almost make the assumption that they knew each other before they said they knew each other.
Yeah, or like alternatively, the thing that I was thinking is maybe like she was sort of Ted Bundy's handler in a way.
That's also a good possibility, but I don't have really much evidence that's it's that direction. So,
Yeah,
but it's a possibility.
But in any case, like Anne Rule basically said, oh yeah, the witness picked out Under Sheriff Ben Meyers, and she pretty much just brushes this off aside as though the witness was wrong. The witness like didn't know what she was talking about. She made a mistake. But I mean, I find it to be a bit of a weird coincidence that she just happens to pick out the second in command of the sheriff's office as the person who was involved in the murder. Like, that seems like a bit too big of a coincidence to ignore. But anyway, when I actually like looked up,
I also can recall that there was a young co-ed missing, and she was the police chief's Midville's daughter.
Yeah, that happened too. Back when he was committing crimes in
Utah. Yeah.
like one of the victims, Melissa Smith, was
Yeah.
the daughter of the police chief there.
Yeah.
And I mean, once again, they just say they don't seem to think there's anything significant about this. But I have a feeling that this was actually a politically sanctioned hit against the police chief. And there are other examples of that too, like.
But what was the motive behind the Karen Campbell murder? Because I also thought her husband was a doctor, right?
I don't know what her husband did. He might have been a doctor. I do know that her brother was a police officer in Fort Lauderdale, Florida.
Okay.
So that might have been a motive. But yeah, I do want to look more into what the motive might have been behind Karen Campbell. But anyway,
I know. I also thought the disappearance of Debbie Kent and Carol Durance at the same time and 100 miles apart from each other. I thought that was really weird circumstances.
Yeah, I don't think it's like even possible that Bundy could have committed both of those crimes. And I remember reading in McGowan's book that originally the witnesses who were at the school identified a drug dealer as the suspect.
Yeah, correct.
Bundy, and then they later sort of changed their identification to pick out Bundy instead, which could not have been possible.
Also, if you think about the arrest of Ted Bundy, it's also pretty suspicious that he wasn't arrested by one or two cops, but there were with a half of dozen of them.
Yeah, you're right, and there wasn't really any cause to stop and arrest him in the first place. Like, they pretty much just pulled him over for no reason, no legal justification. So I mean, I'd say there are pretty clear signs that Bundy was being set up throughout the whole case.
Mm-hmm.
But I am inclined to think that Bundy was involved in some way, but I don't think that he was actually doing the physical murders themselves.
Well, I do think he committed a few murders of him by himself because he has a really recognizable story with a lot of credibility. But I do think the majority of the murders was performed by multiple people and also with alternative motives.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, the thing that, because in the you remember reading about File 1004, the thing that talked about satanic involvement in the Seattle murders.
Yeah.
Right, and there were witnesses there who said that they saw Ted leading satanic cult meetings and talking about devil worship and witchcraft and stuff like that.
Yep.
So the thing that I've felt about that is that maybe Ted Bundy was sort of a Manson-like cult leader, and he would have these other people go around with him committing these murders.
Yeah, I do think there are a few instances, a few cases, especially the abduction and disappearing of Linda Ann Healy. It really screams out there were multiple perpetrators, and she was. There were also, I think, there's always also telephone calls, harassment to the
Yeah.
victims, and I think that's also being ignored mainly by the mainstream media. But I think it's a very important thing that they're always stalking, they're always harassing on the phone in these cases with each other.
Hmm.
Always
And
yeah.
right, and you remember that thing that I also brought up that one other suspect in the Seattle murders who was not Ted Bundy just happened to move to Utah at the same time that Ted Bundy did, and then they were actually a better suspect for the Carol Durant abduction. Like they actually fit the description better than Ted Bundy did.
No. Yep.
Yeah, so it seems as if like Ted Bundy moved to the state at the same time that other potential members of his cult moved as well. And then there was also that person in
I also have a big hunch that the whole thing with the Mormon church in Utah was kind of indirectly or directly involved in these killings because I've read about really weird things about Utah and how they share women with each other and have a whole different mindset than most people.
right, yeah. I mean, a while ago I remember watching this Dateline episode about the Mormon church, and there was this pastor there who was abusing, I think, hundreds of young girls who were part of the church, like they were all his wives, and he was sexually abusing them and then even taping it on audio tape, and it was a super disturbing thing to hear about. So I definitely agree with you. I think that there's a lot of sick stuff going on in Utah, and Bundy was probably linked into it in some way. I think, wasn't he, didn't he convert to Mormonism at one time?
Yeah, it was because of his wife, Lynn Kendall. Her parents were Mormons and he did it for her. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Um,
What do you
but,
think about the aspect that he was also photographing his crimes? Because I read in one book, I can't remember which book exactly, that he was photographing his crimes, that he was spooked out by police when they had a search warrant once, but they didn't find the photographs, so he burned them. But what do you
yeah.
think of that? That he was photographing these things, and if police have found those photographs, why didn't they show it at the trial or anything else?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good point, and that sort of thing, it happens with a lot of serial killers. Like, I know that, there's sort of this pervading claim that, like, snuff films are a myth, but whether or not, it seems like there's always evidence that snuff films exist, but no one's been able to find them, but there's definitely evidence that many of these serial killers are taking, still photographs of their crimes,
Mm-hmm.
and I think they serve pretty much the same purpose as snuff films, but, like you say, uh, if the police had these pictures, they would be a piece of incontrovertible evidence that Ted Bundy was involved. It would pretty much just be a smoking gun as to convicting him. And
Yep.
you don't see any possible reason why they wouldn't introduce him in court unless they somehow either cleared Ted Bundy or they showed other people who were involved. And I think that it's likely that.
Correct. I think it's the same case on a little bit of a side note with the case of Leonard Lake and Charles Ng. They never produced videotapes of Ng committing any murders because I think they don't had any.
Yeah, I mean, either they don't have them,
Or with other
they
perpetrators, yeah.
they don't want to show them because it would pretty much just blow away the whole lone serial killer mythos.
Yeah.
Right. And but anyway, I mean, back about the Pickton County Under Sheriff Ben Meyers, because there's a
Yeah.
whole big weird story regarding him. Basically, in Grand Junction, Colorado, was pretty much widely known as a nice sort of idyllic town to live in. It was pretty peaceful. There wasn't a lot of violent crime going on. But then in 1975, that all changed, and there were a series of really mysterious murders that were rocking the whole town. All of the murder victims were pretty much young women who were somehow involved in drugs or prostitution. Like you had Denise Oliverson, who disappeared in I think April of 1975, and that murder was attributed to Ted Bundy. Like Ted Bundy actually, you know how, do you remember how when he was on death row and they were about to execute him, he just gave all these sudden confessions to all these murders, but a lot of the details were incorrect?
Correct. Yeah.
Right. And one of the murders that he confessed to was Denise Oliverson, and it seems to me like you remember, like similarly in the case of Henry Lee Lucas, they were just taking him on tour, getting him to confess to all these murders that he had nothing to do with, so that they could clear the books and close these cases.
Yep.
And I think the same thing happened with Bundy. They were just trying to get him to confess to all these murders that could have possibly been committed by him, and just say, okay, Bundy committed them, we can close the case now. And Denise Oliverson was the first of the Grand Junction victims where that happened. After Denise Oliverson, a woman named Linda Benson and her 5-year-old daughter were murdered, and this supposedly was done by a different serial killer, Jerry Nemnick. Then in August, Patricia Botham and her and her across the street neighbor, Linda Miracle, and Linda Miracle's 2 sons were also killed. And her, Pat Botham's husband, Ken Botham, he was charged and convicted of these murders, and he's been in prison for 39 years. But if you actually, go through the evidence and you, look through what happened at the trial, you see that the police have pretty clearly been, manipulating things and trying to get witnesses to lie, and so that they could frame Ken Botham for his wife's murder. And then finally, Deborah Tomlinson was murdered in December of 1975, and so you have all these mysterious murders, and they're all being attributed to lone nut serial killers, or the husband did it. But what it really seems like, all of these murders are part of a consistent pattern. Like, according to one website that I found about the Ken Botham case, all of these victims were involved in drugs. All of these victims were, sexually involved with the police officers, which was another weird thing. Linda Miracle's boyfriend was a cop in Grand Junction named Truman Haley, and other women similarly had, police officers that they were sexually involved with. And it turns out that the police chief himself would actually be partying with some of these victims. Now how does that sort of thing happen? Why would the police chief be at parties with these women who are involved in drugs and prostitution?
It's the same exact thing in Long Island, Long Island killer, who is still unidentified,
Right. So it seems like, this is a situation where these women are basically being abused by people in power, and then when they try to speak out about it, they just end up murdered, and then they just attribute them to serial killers or innocent scapegoats like Ken Botham.
Wasn't the first lawyer that Bundy took murdered with a motorcycle accident?
Yeah, well, that sort of thing happens a lot in other cases too. I think, wasn't Charles Manson one of the first lawyers that he had pretty much died soon after he took on the case? So that sort of thing is really common too.
Yeah.
What defense lawyers essentially being silenced. And anyway, so the police chief of Grand Junction, Ben Meyers, it turns out that Ken Botham's investigators were looking into the chief, Ben Meyers, and they found that he had large deposits in 2 of his bank accounts, and they tried to get a court order to subpoena them, but the court denied it. And then immediately after they got this court order, Ben Meyers just resigned as police chief. He cleared all of his bank accounts, and then he went to take his job in Aspen, Colorado instead. So it seems like, Ben Meyers was, definitely involved in all sorts of shady dealings with drugs and prostitution there. And as soon as they were about to catch him, he just fled, got rid of all the evidence, and then he turns up presiding over the Bundy investigation in Aspen, and then this witness picks him out as the perpetrator in the murder of Karen Campbell. Like, that to me just seems like too big of a coincidence to, not be significant. It seems like Ben Meyers was definitely involved in all of this corruption there.
Well, I think that's an astute observation for all the information I just heard, yeah.
And also, there was actually, there was a podcast, a while ago, a couple years ago, there was a podcast called Junction, which was trying to look into these murders. Unfortunately, the podcast ended after only 3 episodes because I guess the person who was doing it ran out of funds or whatever. But in the very first episode, he interviewed 2 people who talked to Pat Botham like a week before she was murdered. And Pat Botham said that she and Linda Miracle were going to come forward with some news that was going to shock the whole town. So it certainly seemed like there was, a big revelation that was about to come out, and then all of a sudden they just get murdered a week later. Like, seems pretty likely to me that they were, silenced because they were about to reveal something really significant.
Incredible stuff.
Yeah, and that was actually just something that I found out only today, about like a couple hours before we had this call. I was looking into this case a bit more, and I found the podcast and listened to the episodes. They're still online, actually. But yeah, I do think that, Ted Bundy was essentially, if he was involved in these murders, he was, this was a contract hit that he was essentially taking up to get rid of these women. But I think it's even more likely that he wasn't involved in the, in like the Denise Oliverson murder, for example, and he just took the rap for it because they needed to close the case.
Yeah, correct.
And,
I also have my suspicion if he is responsible for the Cow Omega murders.
Yeah, I really don't. I think it's highly unlikely that he was. Like, I remember that originally one of the witnesses said that the killer looked like the sorority houseboy, like, didn't look like Ted Bundy.
Correct.
So, yeah, I think that Ted Bundy was probably not involved with that. And also, like, the fact that the semen that they found came from the semen, like, had no blood type information. It came from a non-secretor, but Ted Bundy was a proven secretor.
Yep.
So that makes it pretty unlikely that he was, the source of that. Which is another piece of exculpatory evidence. And actually, like, in that article, that People magazine article that I shared with you, like, the jurors pretty much totally disregarded that testimony about how Ted Bundy was a non-secretor. Like, they didn't understand it at all. They just didn't care. They were like, oh, I felt that Ted Bundy was guilty, and this, like, they just totally ignored the secretor evidence, which makes me a lot, worried that, the whole point of a jury is to, make sure that the prosecution actually proved its case, but it seems like they just, stacked the jury with people who were going to believe anything they heard and not question things.
Yeah, didn't the jury and also trial watchers acknowledge the fact that Ted Bundy was probably not fairly prosecuted?
I know that, like, what's interesting is that, I know that Karen Campbell's brother, who was in Florida, was following the case, and even though, you would think that he would have a vested interest in having Bundy be convicted because he's supposedly the one who murdered his sister, but he himself was pretty much, saying that he was skeptical of whether the bite marks were real. Like, he didn't think that a lot of the testimony was actually convincing in the case. And I actually read something in recent years, like, a lot of the forensics that have been used to convict these serial killers, it's pretty much been acknowledged officially in the mainstream media that this forensics is, not very well substantiated, or it's being manipulated by FBI investigators who are just trying to get a positive result to help the prosecution, even when there's no basis for it.
Yeah.
Like, I don't remember, have you done a video on Bobby Joe Long yet?
No, I only read the chapter on Dave McGowan's book. He brings very good information in that case. That whole case has the terrible stench of a cover-up.
Right, and I like back in May, like a couple months ago, I was trying to find out all the names of the law enforcement officers who were involved in the Bobby Joe Long case.
Oh, nice.
And I found that the FBI fiber examiner, who was involved in the case, was later forced to resign because he had been, lying about evidence and overstating all these fiber matches. So, you have someone who has now been officially acknowledged to be, a liar who is falsifying evidence, and yet Bobby Joe Long is still in prison, still convicted primarily on the basis of this fiber evidence.
Yeah, it's when you've done your homework, it's truly unbelievable the facts that come up.
Yeah, and the other thing that I sort of wonder about regarding Ted Bundy is, there was a story a couple years ago about how they were going to put his DNA into like sort of a cold case, like investigative file, and see if his DNA would match DNA from unsolved homicides. But the thing that I was wondering is, why don't they take his DNA and compare it with the DNA from the cases that he was already convicted of? Right?
Yeah.
Why don't you make sure that these convictions are actually solid? And I think they don't want to do that because they're worried about what they might find. They think that they're probably going to exonerate him or find that he wasn't the only perpetrator, and that would once again blow up this whole mythos, and people are really going to start to question if what we think we know about serial killers is even accurate.
Yeah, I think after McGowan's book, people really should have done their job much better than it is portrayed in the media. But it's just one single theory, just one lone nut, the lone serial killer, the lone wolf, and there's no bigger group involved in any kind of drug connection or satanic connection, pedophilia connection.
And I think that's sort of like, that's by design. Like, part of the reason is, I think, all of these, when you look at all these assassinations of, JFK or Martin Luther King or JFK's brother, Robert Kennedy, and all these odd things that are obviously politically motivated assassinations, and then every time they just say, no, it was a lone nut, there's nothing significant behind this, Lee Harvey Oswald did it all by himself, James Earl Ray did it all by himself, Sirhan did it all by himself, there's no greater conspiracy. And I think that, people were skeptical of this, so they sort of had to introduce the concept of serial killers to make it seem more plausible that these, lone nuts would just commit these random crimes on their own. And even if you would think that there was some greater motive behind it, they're like, no, it's just a lone nut who's crazy. And like, I think that's part of the reason, like, serial killers are kind of a propaganda effort to change the way that we think about violent crime overall. And so we always assume that it's only one person. Like, we're sort of indoctrinated with the idea, like, two people would never get involved with each other to commit these crimes because they're driven by their own demons and they can only understand each other. But that's, obviously ludicrous. There are all these drug rings or sex rings, all these different criminal organizations, and for whatever reason, it's, people just assume that it's a serial killer instead of assuming, maybe it's a larger group that commits crimes in the same manner. Like for example, like the Atlanta child murders are a big example of that. Because that the Atlanta child murders were almost certainly, like, there was a large pedophile ring in Atlanta that was involved with them, right?
Mm-hmm.
And, there's pretty abundant evidence of that. A lot of the victims were directly associated with these pedophiles. Sometimes there were even witnesses who said that these pedophiles were the ones who murdered them. But the FBI rolls into town, and the FBI immediately sends in its famous profilers, and the profilers just say, oh, there's just one black serial killer who's behind all the murders, which makes absolutely no sense. There's clearly this large underground ring that's behind them all. So I think that the whole, like, serial killers have been introduced to rewrite the way that we analyze crime and get us to, dissuade us from even considering the whole conspiracy angle, even though that's more often than not, that is what's really happened.
Yeah, that's my same suspicion, I think, and an excellent choice of words. Yeah. Yeah.
Hmm. So
What do
yeah, I
you
mean that.
think of? Have you investigated whatever Ted Bundy was ever sexually abused? Because I saw on Oxygen a new show about the Ted Bundy case where his defense attorney made revelations, and he said that Bundy stated to him that he was playing some sex game in the woods with a 12-year-old boy, and that was his first murder victim.
No, I haven't heard anything about Bundy being, sexually abused, but it wouldn't surprise me. It seems like almost all of these killers are like have this prior history of sexual abuse, even when it's like I know that with Jeffrey Dahmer, you've been doing some great work in that regard, like trying to find out like what is the truth behind his alleged sexual abuse, because his father said that it was a neighborhood boy, but there are other indications that maybe it was actually Lionel himself who was perpetrating the abuse. So I mean, I don't know anything more about Bundy being sexually abused. I do plan to look into that now that you brought it up, but it certainly would fit in everything else that we know about serial killers and their life histories.
There's also another book. I think it's called Confessions of a Felon Hook. I have to see again what the proper title is. But it's made statements that Ted Bundy was also possibly homosexual.
Hmm.
So that's also pretty interesting. And I also had some YouTube comments that stated that fact from personal experience. They said that they knew Ted Bundy, or an aunt of them knew them, and told them stories. And maybe, what was it? No, I forgot what my point was. But it was pretty interesting. Pretty interesting if it really indeed was, if that's the case.
Yeah, I'll have to look at that. So also about like I guess one last thing about Bundy before I moving on to other things that I brought up there is it turns out that like one of the there was a girl in Washington State who her parents thought for decades had been murdered by Ted Bundy, and then DNA ultimately showed that it was another person who committed the crime named William Cosden. Uh, so I think it's already sort of confirming that a lot like we assume that it's just Bundy all on his own, but it's now sort of being officially confirmed that maybe this Bundy mythos is not quite as accurate as we were originally sold it was.
Yeah, correct. I think independent researchers will come with other possibilities, but the old chronicles, the authors will always maintain it was Ted Bundy alone. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean and certainly there are definitely the mainstream media is not that great at you know not the first place I'd go to get a true sense of how the world operates, but I do think that
Same
every
here.
so often every so often the mainstream media releases little sort of snippets at a time of the truth. Like every article has a little tiny bit of truth embedded within it,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
you have to take all of these take all these bits, put them all together, and then you can start to form an accurate picture of how things operate. Like the mainstream media will give you the pieces of the puzzle, but they'll never put it together for you.
Yeah.
And researchers like Dave McGowan, for example, they were the experts at getting all these pieces and then putting them together. And like so every so often you see a story that like sort of casts a bit of doubt on whether Ted Bundy was actually the killer, but if these stories are being released, sporadically over a long period of time, and unless you take the effort to collect them all together and then look at them, you might miss it, and that's how this sort of mythos gets maintained, even when it should be, I would argue, discredited at this point.
Totally agree. Yeah, I would make the same argument about Dave McGowan. He was truly a master in picking the right pieces of mainstream media, which actually show some kind of conspiracy behind it.
Hmm. Yeah. Um, so I mean, after I guess we've said quite a lot about Ted Bundy, but there are definitely other killers that I've been looking at. So is there anything else that you want me to talk about, the links between multiple serial killers, the John Huey case, Charles Manson, or
Maybe about Hillside Strangler and Rodney Alcala.
yeah, sure. So And once again, this came directly from Dave McGowan. I don't know if you saw this, but in his Laurel Canyon book, the epilogue is actually about Rodney Alcala.
Oh, I have to read that immediately. Oh, I'm
Yeah.
gonna read that tonight.
Yeah, there's some very weird stuff in the whole case, like...
I only got the PDF file from Laurel Canyon, so I just wasn't starting at the beginning.
Yeah, and like one of the like strangest things is the crime that Rodney Alcala was put on trial for. The main witness was pretty obviously like totally hypnotized to tell the version of events that police wanted to hear. Because when she initially came forward, she didn't give them anything that would implicate Rodney Alcala, so they brought in a hypnotist and they essentially implanted this story into her mind. And then when she was actually on trial giving her testimony, it was so bizarre. She would often make these awkward pauses. She would be speaking in such a weird manner that the judge almost considered terminating her testimony. And then later, like when his verdict was overturned and they had to do another trial, the woman didn't even remember testifying at the first trial, like pretty clearly because she was in a hypnotic state, and of course she wouldn't have remembered it. So their main witness was like, basically turned into a Manchurian candidate. That's what Alcala's defense lawyer actually called her, to give statements that would incriminate Alcala, even though there was no other evidence for it. So yeah, the whole case is super, super odd, and you definitely should read it. But
Could we start with Rodney Alcala about his childhood, what you know about that, and also his military connections?
well, I mean, it's been a little while since I read about Alcala's past, so I don't remember a whole lot about that. But according to McGowan, it seems like his past was pretty uneventful. Like, he didn't show any obvious signs of like I know that some people like Jeffrey Dahmer, like from an early age, they were doing things like torturing animals. They're building, satanic, like sort of building, pentagrams in their backyard and doing these weird rituals. But there's no sign of any of that happening with Alcala. So I think that it's likely that what happened to him happened in the military. Like he was a more or less normal person, and then when he joined the military, they did something to him. But okay, I just pulled up the Laurel Canyon PDF and I'm reading it. So Alcala, it says that Alcala, he was stationed at Fort. Wait, let me see. He was stationed at Fort Bragg, I think, and he was stationed at the psychological, like basically Fort Bragg had the psychological warfare center there. I think that Michael Aquino might have actually been at Fort Bragg at one point, but Rodney Alcala was there, and then he just showed up 2 years later, having gone AWOL for some unknown reason. He was put into a hospital for psychiatric treatment, and then he was later discharged, and he just, left the military. So
Yeah, maybe he had a similar thing like Leonard Lake. You also went AWOL just after the military.
yeah, so I mean, once again, same sort of parallels that we see. It seems like,
Also Gary Heidnik.
patterns repeat all the time. You could almost swap out one set of names for the other set of names, and you would have basically the same story.
Yeah.
But yeah, so the first thing that Alcala did was in 1968. He supposedly abducted and then raped and murdered an 8-year-old girl named Tally Shapiro, and there is some weird stuff about her family. Like, Tally Shapiro was apparently, like, her family was staying in this hotel that was filled with, satanic rules, and seemed to have a cult presence there. It was definitely not the place where you would want to raise an 8-year-old girl. So there's some suspicious stuff about her own family. But, ultimately the crime is attributed to Rodney Alcala, and he was convicted of the crime. He was ultimately convicted of the crime, but only after he fled LA and went all the way to New York and joined the art school there. And it turns out that one of Rodney Alcala's art school instructors was actually Roman Polanski.
Correct.
Yeah. So I mean, he fled New York and he was evading capture for these crimes for a long time, but they finally did find him.
After
And
appearing on the dating show.
well, actually, no. Like, I'm pretty sure that he appeared on the dating show after his conviction for abducting and murdering the 8-year-old girl. Like, somehow, like, he had this thing on his criminal record, but after he was released on parole, he was able to get on the dating game show. Like, they didn't catch, their background check didn't realize that he was a child rapist, which is really weird. So also turns out that he was incarcerated at Vacaville, the California prison where they were doing mind control experiments, and like you remember reading about Vacaville before, right?
Yeah, most definitely.
Yeah, and I don't know if you did a video on this, but have you heard of the Symbionese Liberation Army, the people who kidnapped Patty Hearst?
A little bit. I also thought a victim of John Wayne Gacy had a connection to that.
Wait, Gacy had a connection to...
Yeah, a victim of John Wayne Gacy.
Oh, I haven't heard about that. I'll have to check that. It definitely could be. Because I remember, like it's pretty much been confirmed by CIA documents that mind control research was going on at Vacaville, and Rodney Alcala was there during that time, and...
Edmund Kemper. Herb Mullin.
Right, and also the leader of the Symbionese Liberation Army...
I think even also Charles Manson.
Yeah, Charles Manson was at Vacaville too. Like, all of these serial killers are ending up at this place while mind control research is going on. There's definitely a curious pattern there, and I would recommend doing, like, looking a bit more into the Symbionese Liberation Army and maybe doing a video on that, because that, there's the connections to Vacaville, there's the involvement of F. Lee Bailey, the same attorney who was involved in the Boston Strangler case and framing Albert DeSalvo.
Yeah.
He was actually Patty Hearst's defense lawyer, and it seemed like he intentionally sabotaged her defense so that she would be found guilty. Like, he apparently was drunk during part of the trial, and he spilled something on himself during the closing argument of his trial. It really just seemed like he was a CIA appointed lawyer whose job was to sabotage Patty Hearst.
Interesting.
Yeah, but anyway, so the main thing about Alcala that I found curious was that his crime sprees overlapped both the Hillside Strangler killings and the Son of Sam killings. Like, he was in...
Sorry,
Okay,
what do you think about the way serial killers are always allegedly posing their victims? Just like the Hillside Strangler, Rodney Alcala was later doing that. Like, they are posing the victims. Also the Gainesville Ripper in Florida. They also pose the victims for ultimate shock value. And
well, yeah, I mean, that's pretty much exactly what was happening in Vietnam during the Phoenix program.
Yeah, thank you for the reference, yeah.
Yeah, they wanted to, like, the whole point of that was the U.S. is, essentially the U.S., when they were enlisting people in the Phoenix program, they were also essentially enlisting serial killers, and we didn't call them serial killers because they were supposedly fighting on, our side. They're fighting for what's right, and we didn't call them serial killers, but that's exactly what they were. They were going into the homes of the Vietnamese people. They were brutalizing them. They were committing all these gory acts of violence, and they were intentionally posing these victims to, totally freak out the rest of the Vietnamese citizens and frighten them into submission. So it's the exact same MO as the Phoenix program, but as soon as you bring it home, you go from being, a good soldier of the United States to a horrific serial killer, when it's really the same thing.
Yeah, we could ask Arthur Shawcross.
Yeah, that sort of hypocrisy is, like, one of the most galling things about it. The U.S. creates serial killers for its wars that it fights abroad, but it doesn't call them serial killers. It just calls them soldiers.
Do you know that Kenneth Bianchi is still working on a film with an independent filmmaker in England to portray his innocence?
Oh, really? He is?
Yeah, I think he's doing that for 2 decades now, but I hope the movie's coming out soon.
Yeah, I'd be interested to hear what he has to say. Because I know that...
I do think he was set up with his cousins. I do think there were responsible for some of the killings, but also the killings had also political connections, also sexual connections with prostitution, and also probably LAPD connections.
Well, yeah, I agree with you, and that was sort of what I was planning to get into by talking about Rodney Alcala. Like, uh, now first of all, the thing about Kenneth Bianchi is that, like, you know how he lived in Rochester before he came to L.A.
Mm-hmm.
And when he was living in Rochester, there were some mysterious murders taking place there called the alphabet murders or the double initial murders. Like, there were young girls who had the same initial for their first and last name, who were turning up, raped and strangled. And apparently Ken Bianchi was a suspect in these murders, and there's some circumstantial evidence that his car was actually at two of the murder scenes. And he was apparently fearful that the police were onto him for some reason. He didn't tell his girlfriend why, but he definitely feared that the police were investigating him. So I think that it's likely that Bianchi was somehow part of these alphabet murders. But the way that I came across that is I was reading a
Did you know that Carmen Colon, one of the murder victims, in the days or hours before she went missing, the Secret Service was also in the neighborhood there.
That's what I was. So are you getting the same information from David Hoffman's book? Because I was reading David Hoffman's book on secret societies, and I posted some of that on the CapDef wiki recently.
Yep.
But there are some weird anomalies there. But aside from Ken Bianchi...
Sorry, one more thing. What I found also really weird is that John Carr was also befriended with Maury Terry, the author. According to Hoffman's work.
Yeah, I don't know exactly what to make of Maury Terry. Like, I think his research is pretty much solid, but it's possible that he sort of intentionally, he didn't go as far as I would have wanted in exploring the intelligence connections to things. Like, he talks about satanic cults, but he doesn't quite link it to, a lot of other politically significant stuff. Like, he vaguely alludes to, Ronald Stark, the big-time LSD dealer who was connected to Charles Manson, being involved, but I think that Maury Terry, he doesn't take things as far as I would have wanted him to.
Yeah, same here. But please go on, sorry.
So the thing is that according to David Hoffman, aside from Ken Bianchi, he also implicates John Carr and Michael Carr as suspects in the alphabet murders. So if Ken Bianchi and two of the Son of Sam cult members were all involved in these same murders, and it seems like Ken Bianchi, he might have had some sort of affiliation with the Process Church that was there in New York at the time. So I found that a bit of an interesting connection. And then of course, Bianchi goes to LA, he joins up with his cousin Angelo Buono, and then there are a lot of Hillside Strangler murders that take place, but like you, I don't think that they were the only perpetrators. I think that there were a lot more people involved, and they just took the rap for everybody.
I think even the mainstream media, the news reporting, was also just acknowledging the fact that there were possibly multiple perpetrators and alternative motives.
Right. So. And of course, Buono had, he was well connected to people in Hollywood. Like, he apparently, delivered a package to Frank Sinatra's home at one point.
Mm-hmm.
And he was running that child prostitution network that some of the elites of Los Angeles were partaking in.
Yeah.
So I think, it seems like a lot of the time these serial killers are essentially these, low-level suppliers, of all these vices that politicians like to pretend they're above, but secretly they're engaging in them. Like, the serial killers are the people who provide prostitutes and provide the drugs, and for a while, they're friendly with the politicians, but then later, they take the fall for everything, and suddenly it's as if these politicians never knew them.
What I found truly fascinating, I found it in a short documentary, a segment that the Attorney General was stating that when Angelo Buono was arrested and they had a search warrant, they couldn't find one single fingerprint in that whole house. Like, he was tipped off, and if he was tipped off, why did he clean up the whole house? Probably because there were perpetrators that didn't want to find their fingerprints, just like LAPD police.
Right, yeah. And also, mean, I remember how, like, basically, while he was in prison, he signed over the deed to his home, and then the next door owner of a glass shop just bulldozed his home and destroyed all the forensic evidence inside.
Yeah,
But
correct.
they never bothered to prosecute the glass shop owner as a possible, accomplice, which is sort of galling to me as well. And also, like, once again, I was looking into the history behind the district attorney. The Los Angeles district attorney, when the Hillside Stranglers were going on, was named John Van de Kamp, and John Van de Kamp seems to have been involved in a lot of other cover-ups. And like, I think, looking into all these officials and law enforcement people who are involved in these investigations is really instructive, because you'll often find other cover-ups they're involved in. Like, there's never just one cover-up they're part of. They're involved in a lot of them. And it seems like John Van de Kamp was involved in covering up a lot of the physical evidence in the Bobby Kennedy assassination. How familiar are you with the Bobby Kennedy assassination?
I did a lot of research on Sirhan, but not a lot of specifically on Bobby Kennedy.
Right. Well, yeah. I mean, I say that personally I know more about Sirhan than I do about the rest of the circumstances of the assassination, but I know that there were a lot more bullet holes in the Ambassador Hotel than could have been produced by Sirhan alone.
That is correct.
And they had to essentially destroy a lot of this evidence to prevent people from figuring that out. And John Van de Kamp was part of the cover-up in that regard. He was, I know that when he later went on to be Attorney General of California, he was involved in other things. Like these, in Mariposa County, California, there was a lot of drug running and corruption. By the way, like, you might find this, like, Mariposa County is where Cary Stayner was working at the Cedar Lodge. It's where Yosemite is. And there were a lot of politically protected drug operations going on in the same place where Cary Stayner was. And we can talk a bit about Cary Stayner later as well, because there's actually this great book on him called Ultimate Prey. Have you read that?
I haven't read that, but I read about its existence, yeah.
Like, have you heard like Ed Opperman's, he actually interviewed the author of Ultimate Prey.
Yeah, I love that podcast. That's a good podcast.
Right, yeah, and I did listen to the episode where you were interviewed on it too. I
will send you that.
But yeah, it turns out like a private investigator who was involved in the Cary Stayner case from the beginning he never believed that Stayner acted alone. He believed that the drug ring suspects who Dave McGowan identified in the book were the perpetrators, and Stayner might have been tangentially involved with these drug ring suspects, but he was not the main perpetrator. And the leader of this whole drug ring group was a guy named Paul Candler, who was a hitman for the corrupt police in Mariposa County. And but anyway, there was a guy in Mariposa County who was a whistleblower. Like, he tried to blow the whistle on all this drug running that was going on. He went to John Van de Kamp, and John Van de Kamp refused to protect. He didn't protect this whistleblower. John Van de Kamp just told the sheriff that this whistleblower had come forward about corruption within the sheriff's office. So, I mean, like, why would you tell the people that he's blowing the whistle on that he's just blown the whistle on you? Like, pretty obviously sold out this guy. And then the person who blew the whistle, Ron Van Meter, he subsequently ended up drowned in a river somewhere, like in Mariposa County. So, I mean, it's pretty clear that John Van de Kamp totally, sold this guy out and was, I would argue, complicit in his murder. So, John Van de Kamp you see him pop up in all these cases in Los Angeles and elsewhere where there is corrupt stuff going on, and it often ties into the serial killers we're looking at. Now, for the Hillside Stranglers, I definitely do believe, like you said, that Buono and Bianchi were perpetrators of some of the killings, but they weren't the only people involved. And the thing is, like, one of the victims that McGowan talks about in his book, named Jill Barcombe, she was initially credited to the Hillside Stranglers, but then DNA showed it was actually Rodney Alcala who committed the crime. And now the way that the mainstream media is essentially portraying it as, oh, there are two totally unconnected serial killers who just happen to murder victims in exactly the same manner, in exactly the same place, at exactly the same time. And, that really does not seem...
That is a red flag.
Yeah, that doesn't seem legitimate to me at all. And I'm just thinking, why would you assume that Buono and Bianchi were the only people involved? I think it's likely that Rodney Alcala was just a part of this group, and he was working alongside Buono and Bianchi and whoever else was involved committing these murders.
Have you heard about the Sunset Strip killers, Douglas Clark and Carol Bundy?
Yeah, I've heard of
Okay,
them.
did you know that Douglas Clark was used to buy upholstery artifacts by Angelo Buono?
Yeah, I do remember that. In the whole, in Dave McGowan's chapter on... I think
They're just all connected. All of them. Really physically, not just really, yeah.
Yeah, on Dave McGowan's chapter, The Next Generation, it was sort of blew my mind how all of these serial killers who... the serial killers in the previous chapter were all in the 1970s, and then the ones in the Next Generation were all in the 1980s, but all these serial killers in the 1980s were somehow connected to these killers from the 1970s, directly connected to them.
Bobby Joe Long was a distant cousin of Henry Lee Lucas. I mean, you can't make this stuff up.
Yeah, I'm saying that truth really is stranger than fiction when it comes to this topic. But yeah, I think that because the mainstream media had already assumed that Buono and Bianchi were the only Hillside Stranglers, therefore Rodney Alcala could not have had anything to do with them. But that's a totally flawed assumption, and I think it's just further proof that the Hillside Stranglers involved way more people than just Buono and Bianchi, and now DNA confirms that Rodney Alcala was one of the members of the group. But Rodney Alcala was also in New York and allegedly committed a murder while the Son of Sam killings were going on. He killed somebody in between two Son of Sam killings, and her body was apparently found on the Rockefeller estate, which is a rather strange place for a serial killer victim to be found.
Yeah, wasn't the girl also from wealthy parents? She was a heiress. Yeah.
Yeah, she was the daughter of somebody who owned this big business on the Sunset Strip.
Yeah.
So yeah, she was once again, it seems like this definitely was not a random killing. The victim was probably selected because of her connections, as a politically motivated hit. But ultimately, that's the sort of connection that I was talking about. Rodney Alcala is seemingly linked to both the Son of Sam and the Hillside Strangler murders, and in turn, Bianchi was involved with both groups as well. So it seems to me these are portrayed as three different serial killings, but I have a feeling that it's really just one cult that's operating nationwide, and the same cult that was involved in Son of Sam was also somehow involved in the Hillside Stranglers case. Because, in the Son of Sam case, I don't know how much research you did into that, but, there were people coming in from Los Angeles to New York to help out with the murders. You remember reading about that anywhere?
Let me think. It's a real long time ago. I read The Ultimate Evil, so.
Right. And like Bill Menzer, who was known as Manson 2, who was involved in the Cotton Club murder.
Wasn't Robert D. Grimston Charles Manson too?
Well, yeah, Manson did talk about. Grimston was sort of involved with Manson, it seems, but the guy who Moriarty actually called Manson 2 was a hitman named Bill Menzer.
Okay.
And Bill Menzer was also, apparently suspected of being the Zodiac killer at one point, which is interesting as well, and I did put that on the CavDef Wiki too. But, Bill Menzer, he came from LA all the way to New York just to participate in these Son of Sam murders. So there is definitely a connection there between LA and New York, and Rodney Alcala is just another example of that.
I also I think I spoke with someone else, and he thought the Son of Sam murders were actually not 100% about those murders, but more a sort of cover-up of child pornography, selling drugs, and other illegal pursuits.
I mean, yeah, it definitely could be. It's also been a while since I've done that much to look at the Son of Sam murder, so I don't know if the victims were totally random or if there was really some motive behind it.
Yeah, that's true.
There definitely could be, and I know that, following the Son of Sam murders, like, officially, there were also a lot of other murders that were clearly, there to cover up the murders, like, to cover up the involvement of the Process Church. Like, Ron Sisman, who apparently had a tape of the Stacy Moskowitz murder, he was killed. Roy Radin was killed by Bill Menser. So
John Carr.
John and Michael Carr both ended up getting murdered. So it seems like there were a lot of subsequent murders to cover up the loose ends left behind by the initial murders. And one thing that interests me as well is that, that John Carr was stationed at Minot Air Force Base in North Dakota.
Correct.
And that's interesting to me because, Minot Air Force Base was part of the Strategic Air Command, and the headquarters of the Strategic Air Command is Offutt Air Force Base in Omaha, where the whole Franklin scandal is taking place, and Paul Benassi even says that he was taken to Offutt Air Force Base for mind control operations. So I think that, the Strategic Air Command network plays an important role in these serial killer cases as well. And there's not a lot of research that's been done into Offutt, but I do think that there's a connection there too. And we can talk later about John Joubert and the other serial killers who are in Omaha, somehow linked to Franklin, which is an interesting thing that people have not researched that much. But before that, I also wanted to talk a bit about how the Boston Strangler might be linked to the Hillside Strangler.
Yeah, please. I've never heard that link before, that connection.
Yeah, so, the Boston Strangler case, I'm sure as you know, it probably wasn't even one guy committing all the murders. There were probably many different killers involved. And one of the suspects in the Boston Strangler murders was a Harvard student named Peter Howard Denton. And Peter Howard Denton, he was a really weird character. He was involved in the whole criminal underworld of Boston. He was both dealing and using drugs, specifically hallucinogens, which I'm sure you know hallucinogens were a pretty major component of mind control programming, which is an interesting thing to see. But he and a bunch of friends they had a bunch of explosives that they were planning to detonate on the Harvard campus, and it just happened that this was on the eve of Hitler's birthday, which Dave McGowan notes could be a significant date for this sort of thing to happen. Might have some sort of, occult significance. But anyway, Peter Howard Denton was in Boston during the Strangler murders. He hated women, and he was a suspect, a pretty good suspect in my opinion. I think, he could, on all the dates when women were murdered, he couldn't account for his whereabouts, or he didn't have an alibi, which was pretty interesting. But anyway, Peter Howard Denton, he subsequently left Boston and he moved to Ann Arbor, Michigan. And while he was in Ann Arbor, Michigan, a string of women also turned up dead there. And one of them was a University of Michigan student named Jane Mixer. Jane Mixer was strangled, she was strangled and murdered in a sort of similar fashion to the Boston Strangler victims. And she was actually left in Denton Cemetery, which is, the guy's last name is Denton, and he's living there at the time, and then a victim winds up in Denton Cemetery. It's kind of a odd thing to see happen. But subsequently, the Peter Howard Denton, he moves to Los Angeles, and he's living in LA when the Hillside Strangler murders are taking place. So I'm just sort of wondering, what are the odds that this guy is in 3 cities, all over. This guy's living in 3 cities all over the United States, and while he's living there, women are turning up strangled.
What did you say his occupation was?
I don't really know what his occupation was. He's apparently he was a really intelligent guy, but he was also involved in the criminal underworld wherever he went. I did find a guy named Peter Howard Denton who is apparently a molecular immunologist. So he works in the medical field. I don't know if this is the same person, but it might be. And apparently Peter Howard Denton was also part of an Oregon commune, which I would want to do more research into. Because that's interesting to hear that he was actually he founded some commune on the West Coast. But yeah, I don't know a lot about Peter Howard Denton, but the fact that he's in all three of these cities during all three of these murder sprees seems like he's a very viable suspect for all these murders, and that he might have been yet another member of Buono and Bianchi's group that was committing these hillside stranglings. And also, do you remember, in Dave McGowan's book, he talks about how another person from Massachusetts might have also been involved in the hillside stranglings. There was a guy named George Shamshak who escaped from prison in Massachusetts around the time the hillside stranglings started, and then he was recaptured when they ended, and he actually confessed to the murders.
Yeah,
pretty much,
yeah, that's correct. I also have archived video material uploaded from just mainstream media. And I also thought he said that he had actually audio recordings of the killings that he would play to the media, but they never released it.
Yeah, so, I mean, I think that, the fact that there's another person from Massachusetts who was confessing and giving these audio recordings, and then there's Peter Howard Denton, who's living in LA at the time, does make me think that there is sort of this link between, serial killing activity on the East Coast and serial killing activity on the West Coast. And the Son of Sam case is an excellent case in point because the Process Church was, operative from coast to coast. So I think that a lot of these serial killers, even though people don't realize it at first, are probably connected to each other in very significant ways, and they might be part of the same cult, and yet they get portrayed as totally independent of each other, which I don't really buy at all.
No, I don't think, and anyone who's listening in wouldn't say that, no.
Yeah, so that's the thing that I came up with for, I do think, the Hillside Strangler, the Son of Sam, Rodney Alcala, and the Boston Strangler, for all we know, could all be really part of the same operation. I do think that there's a big nationwide network in place.
I think, I think the Lawrence Bittaker and Warren Norris is the exact same timeline, and also in California.
Yeah, I think that, in between the Hillside Strangler case and the Sunset Strip case, they were committing their serial murders too.
Even I can remember that just when the Hillside Strangler killings were ended, the Bittaker and Norris murders were starting, and they were even for shock value exposing their victims in the exact same way that the Hillside Strangler were also doing.
Yeah, and I remember watching your video about that. I found it so strange that, there were all these people who apparently, were being shown these pictures and they had some kind of advanced knowledge, but they never bothered to tell authorities.
Yeah, I really have doubts what the hell was going on in that motel where he's staying, where he's living.
Yeah, and also, Lawrence Bittaker, the place that he worked at is, it said that he's an airplane machinist, a mechanic essentially.
It was in Burbank, California, yeah. But I think there are Lockheed Martin defense contractor links to that.
Well, yeah, that's what I was thinking. Because, Wikipedia doesn't directly say that he, that he worked, for an aircraft company. Although it used to say that until it was later edited away. And I did find another website saying that he worked in an aircraft company in Burbank. Well, the biggest company there I can find is Lockheed Martin, and Lockheed Martin has its Skunk Works facility. So, and, basically the Skunk Works is all this top secret research with the CIA. So there's basically a CIA front in Burbank that most likely employed Bittaker, and, I mean, that seemed like a pretty clear, a major high-level connection.
Yeah, if you watch some archived material on Lawrence Bittaker from his trial, it was also apparent that he was testifying for court to confess that there were also colleagues who were made the threats to other colleagues. So he was, I think, in an environment at work that was also not pretty healthy.
Right, yeah. And I mean, I haven't been able to confirm this, but I've heard all these major defense contractors are often, they sort of operate fronts for mind control. How much have you done about McMartin? Because I know, the McMartin school and the tunnels were actually built by Charles Bucky, the father of Ray Bucky, and Charles Bucky was an engineer at Hughes Aircraft, which is another CIA front, essentially.
No, I only read Dave McGowan's Program to Kill. There's some chapter on McMartin, the McMartin preschool case. And I also saw a lot of documentaries on YouTube, but not any other books. No.
Yeah, well, if you read Alex Constantine's work, like if you
Yeah,
like
I read Covert War Against Rock and the O.J. Simpson PDF file. That's really good.
you have Psychic Dictatorship in the USA.
No.
Yeah, if you get that, he goes into more detail on McMartin, and I think he talks about the involvement of Hughes Aircraft.
Okay.
Like, that's a pretty interesting thing that I found. But also, like, I was blown away when I saw that the detective who was involved in the Bittaker and Norris case, he later was a private detective involved in McMartin.
Yeah, Paul Bynum, yeah.
And he supposedly killed himself just before he was going to testify, conveniently enough.
Yeah.
And I mean, I looked into that a bit. His motive for suicide doesn't make that much sense. He's like, I'm worried they're going to kill my wife. I'm worried they're going to kill me and my family, so I'm going to kill myself and leave them behind when they could still be killed. Like that motive.
Yeah, it really
mind.
doesn't make any sense, and I think even people in his closest family circle and also professional circle were acknowledging that it wasn't indeed really apparent that it was a suicide. They said it was a suicide, but they couldn't say 100% for sure.
Yeah, and I mean, definitely McMartin had a lot of strange deaths popping up. Like one of the drug suppliers named, I guess his name was the Wolfman, but his real name was Robert Winkler, and he was identified by a bunch of children. He was about to testify, and then he supposedly turns up dead from an overdose. Like, you have all these weird deaths that pop up in McMartin, just as they pop up in all these other cases. Sure. So, what do you want to talk about next? Like, do you want to talk about the Omaha connections, or the John Huey stuff? Like,
Let's talk a bit about Gary Ridgway, because I never done a video about it, and I saw a lot of documentaries, but if you have new information, please.
Oh yeah, I don't have a lot about Gary Ridgway, but the one weird thing that I found while looking into the case was that, I was looking into the Pickton case as well, because, these two cases took place around the same time, and they both involved, victims who were, prostitutes, and...
Yeah, excuse me, there are even rumors that Gary Ridgway was actually attending one of the Piggy Palace parties over there.
Well, that's what I was about to bring up, because It turns out that one of the victims of Robert Pickton, she talked about how she knew someone named Gary Leon and partied with him. And Gary Ridgway's full name is Gary Leon Ridgway.
Yeah, correct. Yep.
Yeah, so you have this woman who is a victim of Pickton, but she also partied with Ridgway, and it certainly makes me think that these two things are part of the same network. And I mean, I haven't done a lot more research into Ridgway, but I think that it would probably turn up the same sorts of things that are turned up with Pickton. Like, I think that, both Pickton is sort of analogous to Gacy in that they're sort of like the convenient psychopaths who you use to dispose of victims from this prostitution network. And they're not the main player, but they take all the blame. Like, Gacy was connected to the Delta Project in Chicago that I already talked about a bit with.
Yeah, I think also Gacy was just fucked because he owned that house. And he also stated in interviews I can't believe there are 33 bodies under that house. Meaning that he thought there were some bodies under that house, maybe 5 or 10 of them, but not 33.
Yeah, and so first of all, like, there's actually an audio recording that I found. Like, Gacy had a friend while he was in prison, named like Andy Mapsey, and this friend would like talk with him on the phone. Gacy would send him artwork that he painted, and like you actually showed some of that artwork. Like, that house that Gacy painted that had that other guy who was digging the crawl space.
Correct.
Yeah, that was something that Gacy painted and he sent to Andy Mapsey. But Andy Mapsey also tape recorded his calls with Gacy, and on one phone call, like, Gacy actually says, and I think there's an exact quote, like, he says, aside from the 12 keys, we already know that Rossi, Cram, Paske, and Norman were involved in the case.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I wish more people knew that. Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, like, Gacy himself, he was aware of Paske and the fact that Paske was connected to John Norman, and he was basically saying that, these people were essentially taking advantage of me. They were dumping their own victims there, and, like, I think that Gacy was certainly involved in torturing and murdering many of the victims, but I think that it's just as likely that people like Phillip Paske were taking victims from the Delta Project and they were disposing of them there.
Yeah.
And I think that the way that it sort of works is like, first of all, Gacy had all these young male employees, and it was of course claimed that they had no idea what they were doing. Like, they supposedly didn't know that they were digging graves, even though the stench of decomposing bodies was,
overwhelming.
The entire house. Like, that doesn't make any sense to me, and I think that they were certainly complicit. And if you watch some of the later reports on WGN, you actually see that one of Gacy's employees was like he got drunk and then he was bragging that he knew about a place where there were all these dead bodies buried. So, and this was one of the two people, it was either Mike Rossi or David Cram, who testified against Gacy at Gacy's trial, like for the prosecution. But the prosecution was getting these two people who were almost certainly accomplices of Gacy. And I've also been corresponding with another person who actually saw Gacy's employees going out elsewhere in Michigan, in Illinois, and kidnapping other victims. So I think that what was really going on is that Gacy was sort of using his employees to provide him with young men to torture.
I think one of Gacy's employees was also Robin Gecht, who was the Chicago Ripper ringleader. Yeah.
Definitely. And also, I guess one other weird thing. Have you ever heard of the Oakland County child killer?
Vaguely, but can you refresh my mind?
Sure. I mean, like, basically, this was in the late 1970s. There were a lot of children that were turning up dead in Michigan, and they were turning up in. Not all of them had evidence of sexual abuse, but it seemed like in some cases, like their clothes had been like freshly cleaned or they had been redressed afterwards. And basically, what it seems happened in the Oakland County child killer murders is that there was this pedophile network run by a guy named Frank Sheldon. Frank Sheldon had an island. He basically owned an island in off the coast of Michigan, and he would essentially fly children to this island where they would be held as sex slaves. And then he would also fly his wealthy elite clients there, and they would have sex with these children. And it's widely suspected that some of these children ultimately, these children who were turning up dead from the Oakland County child killer were actually victims of Frank Sheldon. And what really went on is more like you remember from the whole Doug Clark case where two of the victims were prostitutes who went to see these elite Hollywood type people, and then they turned up dead later.
Yeah, Rod Stewart. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think what really happened in that case was there was some sort of altercation with these Hollywood figures, and they were murdered in the house, and then it was just staged as a serial killing.
Well, that's not exactly the same thought, yeah.
Or like the JonBenet Ramsey case, where she was probably murdered at the Christmas party, and then they staged it as an intruder. And I think that the Oakland County child killer is another parallel to that, where I think there were wealthy politicians or other businessmen who were abusing these victims, and they essentially they murdered them, and then they had to wash the victims' bodies, clean their clothes to get rid of any forensic evidence, and then they would plant them, and it would seem like they were serial killers who did that. Because apparently some of the DNA on these victims matched these low-level pedophiles who were linked to Frank Sheldon. So it's Frank Sheldon is the middleman. He hires these low-level predators to do a lot of the grunt work, and it was the wealthy elites who actually murdered the victims. So, I mean, it's a really disturbing case, and I've only just started to look at that, but I do have some content about that on the CavDef Wiki. it certainly seems like it's, it's very similar to both the JonBenet case and the Doug Clark case that I mentioned. So, yeah, if you want to look into that case sometime, I have a lot of stuff compiled on the CavDef wiki about it.
No, I will definitely trust more how do you pronounce it?
CavDef.
CavDef than WikiLeaks. The Wikipedia, yeah. I've one more. I've one. Do you know anything about the Herb Baumeister case? Because there's so little information about that and so little videos and yeah. Do you know anything about that?
No, the Herb Baumeister case is actually it has the least information on the CavDef wiki so far because I haven't really looked into it that much.
Oh,
I do think that there is definitely some strange stuff going on, like the fact that he was affiliated with the Indiana Children's Bureau, which might have been a way for him to get some of his victims, and the fact that he had this hidden camera in his house, and then he was seen in Canada with these tapes in his car, and then later he was found dead, and the tapes were all gone.
Correct.
I think that there was a much larger criminal enterprise going on, like maybe he was...
Also the fact that Also the fact that he was burying many bones in his garden connects to some kind of occult theme to it, or yeah.
I mean, I personally suspect that he might have been, making snuff pornography, essentially.
Yeah.
That's what he was taking with him in his car, and, for all we know, he was a well-connected guy. He was, treated as a businessman, pillar of the community, and maybe there were some prominent people that he was having over for these sorts of parties, and he might have been taking these tapes with him as blackmail material, to use because the police were cracking down on him, and he immediately flees the country. It seemed like he was planning to take these tapes and expose everything, but instead he ends up murdered, and the tapes are just gone.
Yeah, despite his alleged suicide, it really was described as a ritual homicide.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, once again, like we said, it seemed like whenever we're about to get evidence of these snuff films or whatever, they're just gone. Like the evidence gets cleaned up.
Well, actually, I've read comments on internet that some people claim to have seen Herb Baumeister's videos on the dark web, and they were truly exposing some kind of paranormal activity in that house.
Oh wow!
They said, they said they saw bodies of a body on a bed who was just moving by itself up in the air and crushed.
Wow.
Yeah, really, really bizarre stuff. I don't know which forum I was reading, but.
Yeah, and I do think that the Oakland County child killer was quite possibly a similar scenario. You had these elite people who were abusing these children, and for all we know, I don't know if it was filmed, but it certainly could have been somehow, recorded. It seems there might have been some sort of ritualistic thing going on, and then as soon as they were murdered, it had to be staged as, just another serial killer when it was really this,
an organization.
Depraved party with the elites going on. And there are two curious things that pop up with the Oakland County child killer case. First of all, John Wayne Gacy might have been involved somehow. One witness who saw a victim just before they were abducted was pretty sure that they saw John Wayne Gacy with them. John Wayne Gacy might have actually been the abductor. And John Wayne Gacy was with a young man in his late 20s. And this young man was actually talking to the victim just before they got abducted. And I have a suspicion, I can't prove it obviously, but I think that this young man might have actually been Phillip Paske. Because, Phillip Paske was in his late 20s, he fits the same age, and most of Gacy's other associates were, they were younger. Most of his associates, I would say, were early 20s, or even 18 or something.
Yeah, I think Michael Rossi was only 18 years old.
Yeah, but Phillip Paske was about 25 or 26 at that point. So
yeah, correct.
So I think it's quite possible that Gacy might have been grabbing some of the Oakland County child killer victims, and Phillip Paske could have been the one with him. But the other weird thing, and this is really strange, is that like I said, Frank Sheldon had this island, island off the coast of Michigan, called North Fox Island. And in order to actually get there, he had to build a totally new airstrip to fly planes there. And while this was going on, the director of the Michigan Aeronautics Commission was James Dudley Yeah. So, I mean, that's like, once again, like such a weird thing, but I found that out a couple months ago that
That's really
John,
good investigation, bro.
thank you, and John Ramsey's father might have been involved in protecting this pedophile operation that Frank Sheldon was part of. Uh, because there's definitely I think that like what happened to JonBenet, like there was sort of an intergenerational abuse situation going on. Like I think that
Yeah.
JonBenet was definitely being abused by John and the whole pedophile crowd that he knew. Because John's friend Fleet White was also apparently part of the same sort of intergenerational abuse circle. Because there was this witness from California, Nancy Krebs, who came forward and said, like, I was abused since childhood by Fleet White Sr. and Fleet White Jr. In very much the same way that JonBenet was found dead. Like Nancy Krebs said, like they would sort of strangle me, they would asphyxiate me, and they would beat me on the head when I didn't perform as they wanted. And that was the same exact manner in which JonBenet was found dead. She was strangled and she was beaten on the head. So, certainly seems like, Fleet White and his family was involved in this, but also John Ramsey was sort of prostituting out JonBenet into this network. And if you look into the family history of both John and Patsy, you see some really disturbing stuff. Like,
Mm-hmm.
John's father, not only was he involved in the whole, the Michigan Aeronautics Commission thing, and before that he was actually involved in the Nebraska Aeronautics Commission, which I found interesting given what we know about the whole Franklin case. Like, I think John Ramsey was actually born in Omaha, and then they later moved, 6 years later, to Michigan. But also, John Ramsey's... Okay, this is weird. Like, John Ramsey was originally married to... Lucinda Lou Pash. And Lucinda's mother, Irene Pash, ended up marrying John Ramsey's father. So the wife of John, the mother of John Ramsey's wife married John Ramsey's father, which is a really sort of weird incestuous type of situation going on. And I think that sort of incest really betrays all the strange happenings with the family. I think that's one of the things that people often don't concentrate on, but looking at all the other stuff that happened to JonBenet, it seems significant to me. I do think there was an intergenerational cycle of abuse with John's father and then John and then to JonBenet herself.
Yeah, it's generational sexual abuse indeed. It's also my same suspicion. I also can recall the last interview John Ramsey gave was when Burke Ramsey was interviewed by Dr. Phil, a 3-part series. And in the last couple of sentences that he spoke out, he said, I don't want that anyone remembered or forget that JonBenet Ramsey was killed on Christmas Day. Like he was really putting the pressure on it that it was a ritual homicide, like Christmas sacrifice. He was really portraying that.
Yeah, and I know that Nancy Krebs, she actually said that certain dates like Christmas were very important to this pedophile group. Like that was when a lot of the abuse would take place. So I think that fits into the same pattern of it being a ritual.
Yep.
But also, if you look at Patsy Ramsey on her side, first of all, some people have looked at the way that she behaves and they think that Patsy Ramsey has dissociative identity disorder. I don't know if that's true or not, but it certainly seems viable. And then Patsy Ramsey was once asked whether she was abused by her parents, and she gave a pretty evasive answer. And it made people very suspicious that she was.
Yeah. Was it one of the daughters of John Ramsey killed in a car accident?
Oh yeah. And I was looking into that too. If you go to the CabDiff wiki page on JonBenet Ramsey, I've done a lot of work in that regard. I can't say that I've really found anything super conclusive that's like a smoking gun in the case, but there's a lot of weird stuff that makes me think that it was definitely a pedophile ring scenario. And further down on the page, I have some stuff about John Ramsey's daughter, Elizabeth Ramsey. Because, it's basically alleged that she was about to come forward with her abuse, and then she was killed in a car accident a bit later. And I have not been able to confirm that she was coming forward with her abuse, but, I've been trying to. I found basically the claim is that she made a suicide attempt, and after the failed suicide attempt, she went into therapy, and in therapy she realized that her father had abused her and abused her with other people in some sort of satanic group, and then she was planning to come forward, and that's when she was killed in the car crash. Now, I was not able to find evidence that she was coming forward or that she made a suicide attempt, but I did find one thing that was kind of weird. I found in Atlanta, I found a police report in Marietta, Georgia, where she was living, and it says that a woman named Elizabeth P. Ramsey was found seemingly dead. But it turns out, this Elizabeth P. Ramsey was much older and was not born on the same day, so it's possible there's just some weird coincidence. But I'm wondering if they sort of manipulated the records to change the person's identity and hide that it was actually Elizabeth Pash Ramsey, John's daughter. If you go to the JonBenet page on the CabDiff Wiki, you'll see all that.
Okay, thanks. I'm gonna look that out. Yeah.
And also, there was this one person who said, I know some people who were insiders from this case, and the relationship that Elizabeth had with her father John was pretty creepy. He would often, whenever he called, she would go back into behaving like a little girl, and she would talk baby talk with him and call him daddy.
Yeah, that's just fucked up. Yeah.
Yeah. So if that's all true, it does make me think that there was something wrong with their relationship. So I am inclined to suspect that it's true. I just haven't been able to confirm it yet. I've been trying to. So, but on Patsy Ramsey's side, there's suspicion that she was abused. Her mother, Nedra Poff, was basically she would make these weird comments about Burke Ramsey's penis size, which I found very odd. And Patsy's father, Don Poff, you hear that he worked for Union Carbide.
No, can't recall.
Yes. Yeah, so you're basically Jonestown, when Jim Jones moved from Ukiah, California to Guyana, they basically set up at an old mine that used to be owned by Union Carbide. And Patsy Ramsey's father worked for the same company, Union Carbide, as an engineer. And again, that's a parallel to how, like I said, an engineer, how Charles Bucky, an engineer for Hughes Aircraft, subsequently worked on McMartin. So it seems like maybe these engineers at all these, major defense contractors and CIA fronts are somehow involved in this ritualistic sex abuse, intergenerational abuse, because again, you see the same pattern cropping up all over the place. And I also found that Don Poff was apparently a Mason. I haven't been able to confirm that much about it, but I have found some evidence that he was, which is interesting too. But yeah, that's all that stuff that there's a lot of weird stuff going on with the Oakland County child killer, how it links up to the JonBenet case, and how it links up to the John Wayne Gacy case too. It's all rather strange.
Yeah, the whole JonBenet Ramsey information you just provided, it's really turning my head around.
Yeah, and I feel like if you actually go into the JonBenet discussion forum, it's kind of frustrating because everyone seems to be of the opinion that Burke Ramsey was the killer.
Yeah, that's just total propaganda. That's from Dr. Phil.
Well, yeah, and also CBS made their whole documentary sort of claiming that and promoting it, but I don't buy that for a second, and I think it's just mainstream media propaganda.
I really think that Burke Ramsey was sexually abused by himself because he showed all the characteristics in that interview.
Well, yeah, that's what I was about to say. Basically the same thing. People often say Burke Ramsey, he's so mentally messed up. He must be the killer. But I'm just thinking, well, why is he so mentally messed up in the first place?
Exactly.
That often doesn't just come out of nowhere. Often that's caused by what happened in the family. And a lot of the signs that they talk about, smearing feces on the wall, being violent, I would say that that's more likely a sign that he himself was sexually abused, just like JonBenet. rather than him being aggressive towards her. I think that they were both victims.
That's true. Those reports were there, and they're really corresponded with satanic ritual abuse. Yeah, that's all right.
And I think also like Fleet White's daughter, Daphne White, like there was this incident where she was hiding in the house, and they actually called the police because she was missing, and then she later got found. And I'm wondering if maybe she was hiding because she was actually afraid of her own parents.
Yeah, if really police have to come to solve that issue, there's really a problem. It's not really a childish prank, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, and like the thing is, JonBenet case is often caught between these two sort of like these two opposing positions. Like people either believe it was Burke, or more rarely they believe that it was one of the parents, but pretty much everyone says Burke. Or alternatively, a minority of people believe it was an intruder. But pretty much everyone thinks that the whole pedophile ring theory is, too outlandish to even consider.
Well, not really, not really. I think this year Netflix released a documentary, and they give some notion that it was indeed a pedophile network. So.
All right, yeah, I'll have to check that out. But I personally think that the only thing that can really explain all the evidence is a pedophile network.
Yeah.
Like it's pretty clear that JonBenet was sexually abused. Like many different doctors independently came to that conclusion. But at the same time, there's no evidence that her parents were probably not the people who directly killed her that night.
No.
However, they were complicit. And like you remember seeing how in 2013 the grand jury actually they indicted the parents, but they didn't indict them on murder charges. They indicted them as being an accessory to murder.
Correct.
And
yeah.
allowing JonBenet to be placed in that position. And people assume that, that's... I found it very baffling that everyone was like, okay, this is clear evidence that they covered up for Burke, but that doesn't make any sense. Like, the charges that they were accused of covering up were child abuse and first-degree murder. And I don't think that it makes any sense that Burke would have been even suspected of either charge. Like, why, like, Burke being suspected of child abuse when he himself is a 9-year-old, just 3 years older than JonBenet, doesn't really sound like he could even be charged with, like, or suspected of child abuse. And as for first-degree murder, most of the people claim that Burke, killed her by accident, which definitely couldn't be first-degree murder. So I don't think that...
I agree. Those charges never made sense.
Yeah, I think that they actually proved pretty directly that it was a pedophile network. They don't substantiate that it was Burke. They show sort of the opposite. It was not Burke. It was an adult or a group of adults who were responsible.
Yeah, my theory is there's just something went completely miss at the Christmas party. Some kind of weird it's a sex game and some.
Right. Yeah, I agree with that too, and I think it's kind of remarkable actually that same theory was independently brought forth by Dr. Cyril Wecht and then also by Nancy Krebs. Like Cyril Wecht, when he was analyzing the autopsy, he said like it appears that JonBenet was strangled and then hit on the head afterwards, and his theory was a sex game gone wrong. And then Nancy Krebs comes forward and she pretty much says the same exact thing, that they would be strangling these girls, and she believes that it accidentally went too far and she was actually strangled to death instead. And so I mean the fact that two people independently came up with the same thing, one person based on the medical evidence and one person based on her own experience, is pretty compelling evidence that that's exactly what happened to JonBenet.
Yeah, it's really unbiased indeed. Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean I think like in the whole JonBenet case, I mean there's a lot of disturbing stuff in there. Like I think that I talked earlier about the whole Grand Junction scandal in Colorado with like Bundy and Ben Meyers and all them. I think that like you remember in Dave McGowan's book how he says that Florida, Texas, and California are sort of hubs for all the serial killing stuff going on. Like those 3 states are hubs.
Correct.
I think that like another hub for all this activity is Colorado. Like you have Johnny Gosch, who was abducted and held at a ranch in Colorado. You have JonBenet being murdered there. You have the Columbine shooting 3 years later. You have NORAD is there in Colorado Springs. You have I think Michael Aquino was stationed there at one point.
Is Colorado not the home of the military industrial complex?
Yeah, I mean Colorado, and like little Littleton, Colorado, like where Columbine was taking place, was apparently like there was a super heavy Lockheed Martin presence there.
Yeah.
Like
I just want to make that point, yeah.
And Access Graphics, of course, John's company was a subsidiary of Lockheed Martin.
Yeah, and there were rumors there was child pornography on the computers after JonBenet's death.
Yeah, I remember that. But also, here's my question: how familiar are you with the Promise software scandal, like with Danny Casolaro?
I know zero about that.
Oh, okay. Well, basically, I'll be brief. There was this software, this essentially like database software for keeping track of court cases called Promise. Promis. Like it was basically an acronym, and Promise was essentially stolen by the U.S. government. They stopped paying the company that made it. They just stole it, and then they gave it to the CIA to put a backdoor into it. So basically, the CIA put a backdoor into the Promise software, and then they sold the Promise software to governments all around the world, so that the CIA would have a backdoor into all these other countries' computer systems.
That's really smart.
Yeah, and Promise was sort of developed over the years into other successors, and there's a successor to the Promise software called Pickton, which was in the FAA's computers on 9/11, and a lot of people think that the reason that the U.S. like NORAD and the others failed to respond to the hijackings is because there were all these war games going on, and there were all these false radar blips of planes that didn't really exist and fake hijackings, confusing everyone. They didn't know where to send their fighters. They didn't know because they didn't know which planes were actually real and which planes were just fake. And apparently the Promise software, which had infiltrated the FAA systems, was a big part of that. Like, Promise was essentially integral to how 9/11 was pulled off. But anyway, there was one other lead that I was following with the JonBenet case, which is that Access Graphics was actually involved in developing an iteration of the Promise software. And once again, if you go to the JonBenet page on the CavDiff Wiki and you scroll down and you search Promise, you can actually view my theory on that. I found solid evidence, but it certainly is it's a bit compelling, and I think that that's what was going on. But ultimately, I think that what was happening with the military-industrial complex in Colorado was essential to the planning behind 9/11. Do you remember how one of the Columbine shooters actually wrote in their diary that they thought about hijacking a plane and crashing
sort of predictive programming.
Well, yeah, and I think what I was wondering is, well, one of these guys, they were at Plattsburgh Air Force Base in New York, and they were hanging out with their father, who was an Air Force pilot, involved with this flight safety company, which I think did flight simulations.
Yeah.
Maybe they overheard something that they weren't meant to about 9/11, because I think 9/11 was being planned for a long time before it actually happened.
Yeah, I never thought about it that way, but it's also a very good connection that you now bring up. It's very good.
Thanks. So yeah, and also I was studying a lot yesterday the whole Pat. You may not have heard of this. There was a case in Colorado involving a guy named Pat Sullivan, who was the former sheriff of Arapahoe County, and he was involved in the Columbine investigation. And he once said in an interview, I strongly believe there was no cover-up in the Columbine investigation. Which I think is pretty clearly not true. There's a lot of anomalies going on with the whole Columbine shooting. But Pat Sullivan was in charge of that investigation. He later resigned, and he got a job at for security of a school district, and he basically got this adult film star and meth addict hired as a security guard at the school. And he was there for 14 days. He supposedly tried to recruit children for some kind of sex and meth ring, and then he was quietly fired. And then Pat Sullivan was also quietly fired, and they claimed he was they claimed that he resigned of his own volition, but someone who looked into that thought that was almost certainly a lie, that he was forced to resign because he was trying to recruit children into this meth and sex ring. And then Pat Sullivan was himself ultimately busted for buying meth and trying to give it to young men in exchange for sex. Because he would find men who were addicted to meth, he would he would essentially trade that meth in exchange for sex with them, and he would be feeding their addiction to feed his own desires, and it was a really really horrible story to hear about. But there were all these allegations that there was a much larger pedophile ring in Colorado that Pat Sullivan was part of, and it was all covered up. And this whole pedophile blackmail network was instrumental to pulling off 9/11 because if you have all these public officials compromised, you can force them to go along with whatever you're planning or sort of false flag doing.
Yeah. All depends on extortion and blackmail.
Yeah, and have you heard of this is about 9/11? Have you heard of Delmar Vreeland?
No.
Yeah, there was this man who this Office of Naval Intelligence operative named Delmar Vreeland, who was in a prison in Toronto, and he wrote a note prior to 9/11 that sort of warned of the 9/11 attacks. He was writing down all these targets like the World Trade Center, like Sears Tower, Pentagon, all this stuff. He wrote a note and he said, let one happen, stop the rest. And they sealed this note away, and then 9/11 happened, and they took the note out, and they realized that he had basically sort of predicted 9/11 in advance. Now, Vreeland is a very controversial figure, and Dave McGowan was also kind of critical of the people who focused on him because Vreeland seemed like he was sort of a honeypot. He had some information, but he was also such a suspicious character that just coming into contact with him was enough to discredit you, because he was also a con man who told all these fake stories.
Yeah.
So Vreeland, as it turns out, he was ultimately arrested in 2004 for making child pornography. He was arrested in Colorado for making child pornography, and he was going around with this kid who he claimed was his son, but he didn't actually have a son. It was more likely that this was some boy that he picked that he was using as a child prostitute. So Vreeland, it seemed like he was involved in this big underground network, underground pedophile network in Colorado, and so was Pat Sullivan, and it was all sort of mixed up with the 9/11 operation. So I think that there's a lot more research that needs to be done into what was happening in Colorado. And I do think that, Grand Junction is another thing that ties into it. All that stuff with Ben Meyers and all the women murdered in Grand Junction, I think that was part of this too. I think there's a huge blackmail network going on in Colorado, using and abusing children for that purpose. And I think that the same people there were involved in planning 9/11.
Yeah, I think there went a lot of preparation into 9/11. I think 2 decades before 9/11 was even realized they were making plans of it, or were submerging imagery through television and movies.
Yeah, I agree with that. Wasn't there was a movie I think released a couple months before 9/11 called The Lone Gunman or something that was pretty much the same exact scenario happening right before 9/11 did. It was in a movie.
Yeah. It's only 2 words: predictive programming.
Right, yeah. So.
Do you have another good serial killer case? An old serial killer case?
So there's not much more that I have planned to say, but there was also that stuff that I can go over about all these weird links to Omaha and the Franklin scandal and Offutt Air Force Base.
Yeah, I've only read, I think, the Franklin scandal from Nick Bryant, but it was 6-7 years ago that I read about that, so not a lot of good memories fresh.
Sure, well that's fine, and most of the stuff I'm covering is not, directly the Franklin scandal. It's more like stuff that's tangentially related. I assume you're familiar with how Boys Town was used by, Boys Town was a place where they would get these child prostitutes for. Larry King would acquire children from Boys Town.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a lot of sexual abuse going on there. One of the weird things I found from Nick Bryant's book was that he said that, a couple victims who Nick Bryant interviewed said that they had been introduced to Larry King by a counselor there named Leslie Collins. It turns out that Dr. Leslie Collins was later arrested for abusing a couple girls, and when he was abusing them, he made threats saying, "I've worked with the CIA, don't do anything or I'll kill you." So this counselor who was giving boys to Larry King pretty much said that he worked for the CIA, which I found pretty interesting. But there was also another person who worked at Boys Town who I also believe was involved with the CIA. Like, you're familiar with how Franklin was called, a carefully crafted hoax, right?
Yeah.
And they claimed that this. You remember the guy named Michael Gacy who they claimed scripted all the Franklin allegations?
Vaguely.
Yeah, like Michael Gacy was someone who worked at Boys Town, and he was later fired. And then Michael Gacy was in a psychiatric hospital where Alicia Owen was also. And
okay.
Michael Gacy, like the state later claimed that Michael Gacy just made the whole thing up, and he gave the hoax to Alicia Owen, and then she gave the hoax to a bunch of other people. Now there was like no real evidence that this is what happened. Alicia Owen was definitely a real victim, and all the other people like Troy Bonner, Danny King, Paul Benassi,
Yep.
They were all real victims. But I was just wondering, like, why is Michael Gacy even here? Might he have been, intentionally planted into the Franklin scandal to, discredit it and give the state ammunition to call it a hoax? And that's what I was sort of theorizing about. Because there are a bunch of weird things about Michael Gacy's background that I found. First of all, he was running drugs to Los Angeles in the 1980s, which is during the whole Iran-Contra period. Like, you're familiar with
of course.
Webb, Dark Alliance.
Yeah,
and so Michael Gacy is
Kill the
running
Messenger is also a pretty good movie.
Yeah, I haven't actually seen that, but I've really been meaning to check it out too. And so Michael Gacy he's running cocaine during the same period in Los Angeles as well. It certainly makes me think that he has some sort of higher level connection there.
So he was actually taken by the government as controlled opposition to create a careful hoax, yeah.
Yeah, that's what and there's other weirdness about Gacy too, like the fact that apparently he had a brother in California who worked in the FBI. So, you have this guy who's supposedly, a drunk who's just, a troublemaker and a hoaxer, but his brother is an FBI guy, and it makes me think once again, maybe Gacy is playing a part, making himself, inserting himself into the story to discredit it, but he's really, working on behalf of the FBI, with his brother.
Yep.
But there, and other stuff about Gacy, we talked a bit about Patty Hearst already, but it turns out that back when Patty Hearst was still missing, Gacy went to the LA Times and he, said, "Hey, I can find Patty Hearst for you." And he convinced the LA Times to fund his whole expedition to, like, Southeast Asia to look for Patty Hearst. And he was like, so I'm just wondering, like, how exactly does this con man dupe the LA Times, which is supposed to be a very prestigious newspaper, into giving all this money and giving all this travel, like, expenses? It seems a bit weird to me. But he supposedly dupes the LA Times into letting him go on this trip. Obviously, they didn't find Patty Hearst because she never left the country, but he did come back with a green, like, with this, like, notebook from one of Gerald Ford's top intelligence advisors, this is a crazy story. Like, President Gerald Ford had appointed this guy named Leo Chern to his, like, intelligence advisory board, and Leo Chern had this green book with a bunch of names of CIA officers in it. And Leo Chern somehow lost this notebook while he was in Europe. He lost his notebook with a bunch of CIA assets in them. And then Michael Gacy goes to Southeast Asia and he comes back home with this notebook. So what I'm wondering is, how did this notebook get all the way from Europe to Southeast Asia?
Yeah,
that
that's really suspicious. I've also read a little bit of a side note that Robert Bardella from Kansas City also had scribblings about Lieutenant Oliver North in his diary.
Yeah, I remember that.
And he also went to Asia, to his flea markets and military background, I think. He hadn't a military background, no.
Oh, yeah, that's a good connection, too. I mean, I was trying to find out exactly what the nature of his connection to Oliver North was, and I couldn't find anything definitive, but it certainly is a weird connection, and he felt compelled to explain it away as innocuous. Like, he was saying, oh yeah, it was just on the TV, like there was nothing more beyond that. Like, it seemed to me whenever a denial goes further than you need it to go, that sort of raises red flags. Like, you're really trying to make sure that there is no suspicion of a connection. That makes me a bit more suspicious that there in fact was a connection.
Yeah.
And also, do you remember? And also, Berdella, like, he was a suspect in the abduction of Johnny Gosch and Eugene Martin.
Yeah, that's correct.
McGowan brought that up in his book briefly, which I also found curious.
I think he was even the leading officer in the neighborhood watch.
Yeah, and he was apparently like a drug rehab counselor. Some people called him Dr. Berdella.
Yeah. He was also affiliated with some kind of medical group who did experiments on people, and when they were cured or were giving those tests, like 30 days, they would give big parties at Berdella's house.
Oh yeah, I think some of his victims were like being checked in mental hospitals for this sort of experimentation.
Yeah.
Yeah, there are a lot of interesting connections there, and but yeah, like Michael Casey comes back with this book somehow, which there's no explanation of how it actually got to another continent. But anyway, he comes back with this book and he like calls up Leo Chern and is like, "Hey, I have your book," and the whole scenario seems like really weird to me, and I don't know exactly what to make of it. Like, you've heard of Mae Brussels' work, right?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Mae Brussels, she was amazing. She was
on
top of all stuff decades before. And I think like she was a big inspiration to Dave McGowan. Like, he quotes her a lot.
Yeah.
Like how she talks about, the use of serial killers to manufacture fear and create the justification for a police state, essentially.
Yeah, she was 30, 40 years ahead of us, always.
Right, yeah. And one great example of that is that in a video in one of her broadcasts in 1978, she was talking about all this stuff with Michael Casey and how Michael Casey had worked at Boys Town, and she was saying that Boys Town was most likely a CIA front. And this was 10 years before the Franklin scandal broke, and Mae Brussels was already talking about Boys Town being connected with
I didn't know that. Jesus.
Yeah, it was incredible for me to come across, but I do think that Mae Brussels was right. Like, Michael Casey seemed like he was just a plant, a CIA plant, essentially. The fact that he was able to come across this book from Leo Chern, the fact that he was involved in the Patty Hearst case, the fact that he involved himself in drug running and the Franklin case are red flags. And the final red flag I found is that Michael Casey actually said that he had experience working in prisons and mental hospitals. Now, and those are, two places that are like the breeding ground for MK Ultra experiments. Like, so the two places where he has a background working are sites of MK Ultra experiments.
Yeah.
And he's also working at Boys Town, which of course is where Charles Manson was staying.
You know what's a good movie about MK Ultra? One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest.
Oh yeah.
That's a really good movie always.
Yeah, I saw that a while ago. But yeah, mental hospitals are definitely one of the foremost spots for the sort of experimentation to take place, and you see that often in McGowan's book. Like, Albert DeSalvo was at Bridgewater in Massachusetts.
Yep.
And one of the there was in the whole the Gainesville Ripper case with Danny Rawling, there was this other suspect, Ed Humphrey, who was at a mental hospital too.
Correct.
And while he was at the mental hospital, that was when the irony is that he was actually relatively normal before he went to the mental hospital, and then he essentially turned into what seemed to be the sort of program killer who was involved in satanic activities and, protecting a local drug dealer and doing paramilitary activities in the woods.
I think even her Baumeister was also admitted by his own father to a mental hospital.
Oh, yeah, I remember something about that in McGowan's book, too.
Yeah.
So, to hear that Michael Casey is working at prisons and mental hospitals is a bit of a weird thing. And, why is it this guy normally portrays himself as this guy normally seems like he's, a drunk, and he's usually the one in the mental hospital as a patient, but maybe that stuff was all an act, and he's actually on the other side of things, and he's actually working in these institutions, working with potential mind control subjects. And
I do think Edmund Kemper is also a perfect candidate for that. If you see him in those interviews at Vacaville and the way he talks about behavioral modification, I think it's really suspect.
Right, yeah. So I mean, like, you're familiar with how Charles Manson, he was at Boys Town for some time.
He was only for a few days, if I can recall.
Yeah, I was. But so I was looking into that though, and I mean, first of all, like Michael Casey, when he was at Boys Town, he was involved in a scandal where he tried to sell, like he apparently like got all these like confidential patient histories of Boys Town students, and he was supposedly trying to sell them to a Hollywood producer to make a movie, and he got fired for that. But what Russell was wondering is maybe he was actually, acquiring these histories to, give to the CIA, for instance, to use for kind of mind control programming. Because if you get the psychiatric history of all these people who are at the institution, you might be able to profile these candidates and see, this person looks like he would be an excellent mind control subject. We're going to focus on him in the future.
That's true. That's good.
I mean, I know, you sort of suspect, don't you, that a lot of people who go into the military are profiled in a similar way to see if they're likely to be, if they're a good subject for this sort of mind control programming.
Yeah, most definitely.
Like Jeffrey Dahmer, for example.
Artie Shawcross, Leonard Lake.
Yeah, they learn about their childhood and they put them into some special program. And also, I think David Berkowitz was also supposedly profiled into a special operation where they were dosing him with LSD all the time.
Yeah, yeah. You also have that with Herb Mullin from Santa Cruz.
Yes.
But he did it he did it not in the military. No, I believe he was also admitted in a mental hospital in Hawaii. I think Mae Brussel made statements that she had information that there was a facility at Hawaii who was actually creating serial killers over there.
Well, yeah, I remember, first of all, Herb Mullin was admitted to a bunch of different hospitals. At one point he was admitted to Mendocino State Hospital, and I found that interesting because the People's Temple had basically taken over Mendocino State Hospital.
Correct, yeah.
With all their own personnel. So the fact that he is then at this mental hospital that's basically being run by Jim Jones' cult was a pretty interesting thing to find. And then, of course, yeah, he goes to Hawaii later. And I don't know if you've come across this before, but Jim Jones himself was actually at a mental hospital in Hawaii back in the early 1960s.
I can't recall that I did know that. No.
Yeah, but
I do know there are also rumors that one of the Jonestown staff members was actually the mother of O.J. Simpson.
Yeah, I do remember that too. I mean, it was a very weird situation with how all the leaders of the Jonestown operation were all white. They were all white men, often politically connected. You had Larry Layton, who was connected to biochemical research with the U.S. government, and you had Jim Jones, who was linked to CIA agent Dan Mitrione. But then all the rest of the people in Jonestown were all black, were all poor black people who signed away all their possessions to Jim Jones and basically made these people rich, and they were forced to work and they were tortured publicly, administered all these weird behavioral modification drugs like Thorazine, which Gary Heidnik also happened to have in his house, and he was also running a church much like Jim Jones was.
Yeah, there are a lot of parallels between Jim Jones and the acts of Heidnik. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's pretty suspect that he was so much into the stock market. I mean, this guy had $500,000 on his banking account.
Yeah, I find it weird how he was able to get all this wealth. Doesn't make much sense to me unless, of course, he's part of this much bigger enterprise that they didn't want to pursue, but he almost certainly was involved in.
Yeah, I can remember also an archive video material that I uploaded that was news reporting. That there was said that moments before he was executed, he said to his daughter in court, "Go to the FBI and we win." And then he gave her a thumbs up. So that's also pretty suspect that he said, "Go to the FBI." I mean, what the hell does the FBI have to do with him directly?
Yeah, I have to look that up. But so in the case of people like Jim Jones, but also someone like Charles Manson or Robin Gecht, I think that all of these people are, or also the person who was running the Symbionese Liberation Army. The name was I don't remember their name. Oh yeah, Donald DeFreeze, who was running the Symbionese Liberation Army. All these people were mind control programmers, but they were also under the influence of mind control themselves. All these people were essentially controlled controllers. They were put into these mental hospitals and these prisons to be experimented on, and then when they came out, they became cult leaders who then gathered other followers and used mind control tactics on them, which is a pretty interesting way to take that direction.
Yeah.
Like, you're not just, like, you're sort of outsourcing the work of creating future mind control victims. You create cult leaders, and then you bring them out to gather followers, and then they can commit murders. But,
yeah, it's really layers within layers.
Yeah, and I mean, about Manson and Boys Town, like, I know he was only out there for a couple days. I'm just wondering, like, what specifically happened to him there, because there was someone in Omaha named Lawson McDowell who actually wrote a book about Manson's time at Boys Town. I haven't gotten the book yet, but I've been meaning to get it. I did find an interview that Lawson McDowell gave, and he says that Manson, quote, fled for reasons never fully explained. It was a mystery that intrigued me. The things that happened at Boys Town changed the course of history in a darker direction for Manson. So,
That's interesting.
Like, what happened to him at Boys Town? Like, I know that he left after a couple days, but did something really traumatic happen to him there? And like I was talking about earlier with Michael Casey, what if maybe Charles Manson, like, he was sort of profiled for the very first time when he came to Boys Town, and they kept an eye on him in the future as a potential subject to be experimented on later.
That's a very good possibility, and I think the fact that he was only there for 48, 72 hours, that really demonstrate that there was something bad over there.
Right, yeah, and but the other weird coincidence that I found with Manson is, like, you know how he ended up living at the Spahn Ranch in, like, outside of Los Angeles.
Correct.
And the Spahn Ranch in Chatsworth just happened to be, like, almost directly adjacent to a ranch owned by a prominent Omaha businessman named E. John Brandeis.
Yeah, I read that in your email earlier, yeah.
Well, yeah, like, I mean, that was just, so, like, E. John Brandeis was arguably, like, the most powerful guy in Omaha. He was, like, he would sort of, like, all these business leaders in Omaha would meet, and they would, like, sit at this large table, and he would basically be at the head of the table, leading the whole discussion. He was apparently a big financial benefactor of Boys Town. He was the uncle of he was actually the uncle of one of the perpetrators in the Franklin scandal. He was the uncle of Alan Bayer. And,
Alan Bayer.
Yeah, he was Bayer's uncle, and he worked, and he allegedly worked for the CIA in some capacity, like worked for intelligence purposes. And so I'm just like, what are the odds that, you know, Manson is at Boys Town, something really bad happens to him and he leaves, then he later ends up living with his family, like basically right next to E. John Brandeis' ranch. Like, what's up with that? And I'm wondering, you know, was Brandeis one of Manson's sort of intelligence handlers, keeping an eye on him, like keeping tabs on what Manson was doing? I mean, it just seems like so odd that he would end up at this, once again, acquainted with an Omaha businessman who was involved in funding Boys Town.
Did you found any news reporting regarding that Omaha citizen staying across from the property, from the ranch?
I do have something about it on the Franklin page on my wiki. So first of all, if you go to the pages I have on mind control programs and you just search for E. John Brandeis, or like search for Alan Bayer, you'll definitely find the person's name and you'll find some stuff. There was actually this person who claimed that they were, you know, that Brandeis was a customer of his, and he was, you know, he was doing the transaction with Brandeis, and then he left and he saw some other people who he thought were really sketchy, and he later realized that they were Charles Manson and his family. So this one guy claims that he saw both of them not that far from each other. And then I have several links that, you know, prove that the Brandeis Ranch was right next to the Spahn Ranch, where Manson was. Like, I have sort of a map that shows an view of that. And they're not right next to each other. They're, like, I think they might be separated by, like, one ranch, but they're pretty much in the same vicinity, and you would probably be able to see one from the other. And on the Franklin page, I also found some evidence that Brandeis was definitely living in Chatsworth, which is the same city in California where all these ranches are. So,
okay.
There definitely is. I do have some news stories about Brandeis. Like, he was apparently in. His wives accused him of extreme cruelty and asked him for a divorce. So there were all these rumors that, like, there were really sadistic sex activities going on in his house, which doesn't surprise me at all. I mean, that's sort of par for the course with the power elite at this point, as we know. Really, I mean, and Alan Baer was, of course, the same way. Like, he turned into a really sadistic person as well, as many of the Franklin victims would attest to.
Yeah, that guy was totally one of the primary suspects in that whole case.
Yeah, so I mean, just kind of like the fact that Manson would be staying so close to Alan Baer's uncle, you know, another one of those spooky coincidences, and you start to wonder, like, how many of these coincidences can there be before it isn't just a coincidence anymore, before it actually means something significant?
No, true. I really, hadn't heard about the connection. I'm learning it today.
Yeah. So, and then finally, like, the other weird thing is, because, you know, like, Offutt Air Force Base was a center for a lot of the mind control operations that were going on with Paul Benassi and many other kids, and apparently, there was one serial killer in Omaha named John Joubert who, first of all, this is weird, like, John Joubert would actually kidnap paper boys, which is sort of like what happened to Johnny Gosch and Eugene Martin. Like, he was following more or less the same MO, kidnapping paper boys, except he would murder them. He wouldn't put them into a sex ring, but I think he was part of the same sort of underground network. And there are a couple anomalous things about John Joubert that haven't really been brought up that much. First of all, that he was an airman. Like, he worked at Offutt Air Force Base. He was a radar technician there. And, you know, like, radar technician sometimes implies that there was actually some sort of intelligence involvement. Because, you know, like, Larry King, while he was in Vietnam, or he was in Thailand, and Larry King did, like, signals intelligence in the Air Force. And, similarly, you have John Joubert, who's a radar technician at Offutt Air Force Base. It makes me suspect there's some sort of intelligence connection there.
Excuse me, let me intercut. Douglas Clark and Leonard Lake were also radio technicians at the top of my head. But please go on.
Oh, yeah, that's a good point, too. So I think, once again, we see there's a definite pattern coming up where a lot of these people seem to have somehow been involved in...
I think even Rodney Alcala.
Right, yeah. I think I do remember reading that, too, when I read, like, the thing in Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon, that, yeah, he was doing radar, he was a radar technician. So, yeah, John Joubert was working at Offutt as a radar technician. He kidnapped paper boys, and he made very strange carvings into his victims, which is another curious thing. Like, I personally, like, suspect that these carvings might be ritualistic in nature. Like, on one of the victims, he carved a star pattern, and on another victim, he carved like something resembling a plant. So, just, like, makes me suspect that he might have been sort of like an occult type criminal. And Noreen Gosch, in her book Why Johnny Can't Come Home, she actually says, and I have this quote on my wiki page too, if you search for John Joubert, Noreen Gosch actually says outright that, like, one of the victim's mothers went to Joubert in prison, and he, you know, basically bragged about how he was part of this, like, underground cult network in Omaha, and he was giving them advice on how to operate without getting caught. Like, he was helping out a biker gang. He bragged about this cult network that he was in. So I think, like, there's definitely there's not much corroboration because John Joubert is not a very well-known case, but I think that it's almost certainly the case that he was part of the same underground satanic network that was later exposed in Franklin.
Yeah, I haven't delved really into that case specifically, but the information you bring out, it really makes some serious connections.
Yeah, and I mean, back in June, I talked to I actually managed to phone up one of the private investigators who worked on the Franklin case. Like, they took over the investigation after Gary Caradori was murdered in that plane crash.
With his son.
The guy's name was Rob. Yeah, with his son, which is even more tragic. Like, you tell, like, whoever sabotaged the plane, they certainly, like, did not value his son's life at all. Like the son was not involved in any way with what Gary Caradori was doing. He was a totally innocent bystander in all this.
No, but I think those things are just to make a bigger impression on the people around them that are living from. We even take your children, your effing children.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think like everyone was pretty much frightened after that point. Like they
Yeah.
realized, well, if they can stop Gary Caradori, the best investigator that we had, like
Especially the victims, Troy Bonner, Alicia Owens, and Paul Benassi.
Yeah, I mean, like, and definitely got to the victim. Like, they forced Troy and Danny to both recant, although they ultimately did end up taking back their recantations and going back to their original story. But, you know, the damage was done, and they were essentially forced to lie to put Alicia Owen away in prison.
Yeah, it's just truly unbelievable.
And then, of course, you know, they just barely managed to convict Alicia Owen, even though the trial was, like, obviously manipulated, and then they just dropped all the charges against Paul Benassi, which was also pretty curious. Like, if they were so confident that they could win, why would they not convict this other guy? But it seems obvious to me that they were actually worried that Paul Benassi would be found not guilty because they couldn't, because it was clear that they were trying to cover up something that was obviously true.
Yeah, I think the way it happened was just on their part a whole way to discrediting everything and anything.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I talked to Robert Hansel, the investigator, and he actually told me a strange story about how, like, Alicia Owen had mentioned this house in Omaha where there were satanic rituals being performed, and they actually found the house, and they found, like, the house was abandoned, but they found an altar, and they found blood on the altar, and they tested it, and they found that it was animal blood. So they actually managed to, and this is not in any of the books or anything, like, this is just something new that I learned last month. They actually did manage to find a satanic ritual site where animals were being sacrificed.
What do you know about the allegations that some people suggested that the place to investigate wasn't really Omaha in the Franklin scandal, but Lincoln? There were a lot of hidden connections in Lincoln.
I mean, I think that is a good point. I mean, there definitely was a lot of stuff in Omaha to look at because most of the, like, the business, even though the political capital of the state was Lincoln, I feel like the business capital of the state was Omaha because you had, like, ConAgra and, you know, Warren Buffett's businesses. You have the Omaha World Herald, obviously, Union Pacific. All these companies are based in Omaha. So I think, like, for the business aspect of the Franklin scandal, Omaha was definitely the place to look. But I do agree with you. I think that there was a lot of stuff in Lincoln that was not pursued as much as it should have been. Like, the thing is that most of the people who were named as abusers in the Franklin scandal were, you know, they were businessmen. But I'm wondering who were the Nebraska politicians that were also abusing these children? Like, we don't really know any of their names.
Yeah, true.
And I think, like, there definitely were state senators who were compromised in some way, but we don't really know who they are. And, I mean, obviously there are also a lot of national politicians. We also don't know most of their names. We know, like, Barney Frank, we know George Bush. Other than that, the names are not very well publicized. I mean, I guess Dick Thornburg, the Attorney General at the time, who was involved in the whole, he was later involved in the Penn State cover-up too, like helping out Joe Paterno. Yeah. I mean, like I said, these same players, they show up all over the place in other cases. It really is staggering.
Yeah, if you really do your homework independently, you see there's a whole, like, an organization, a whole network, the whole trafficking business, which all has all facilitates what all kind of illegal pursuits, child pornography, gambling, extortion, blackmail, organ harvesting.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, like, that's pretty much what I have for, like, now. I mean, I think we touched on nearly every serial killer that was brought up in some fashion or another because there are just so many different, you know, parallels. You talk about one case and you have to bring up all these other links to these other cases.
Yeah, it's really difficult to maintain one subject at a time.
But yeah, I mean, that's all I have for now. I mean, if you want to ask anything more, that'd be cool. But I mean, it's been a great conversation speaking with you. Glad to be able to talk to you about some of this stuff, and hopefully these new leads will be useful for your future video making.
Yeah, most definitely. To be honest, I've never engaged in a conversation with someone so well informed, articulate, and unbiased. So it was really my pleasure.
Thank you. So, I mean, I guess for you, it's like pretty like late at night or even early in the morning at this point. But I mean, have a good night. And I hope to talk to you again sometime soon.
Yeah, thank you. You too. It was really, really my pleasure.